Chapter 2106. Xiao Yang couldn't help but be taken aback when he heard the World Core's question. Could it be that there was something special about where one could break through? Xiao Yang's horizons were extremely broad and lofty. However, he was not very clear about the things that happened in the small world and some of the rules. Moreover, he was not clear about the twists and turns in the small world. Tell me, what's the difference? Xiao Yang asked softly with a frown. Since he was not clear about what was going on, it would not be too late to weigh the pros and cons after getting to the bottom of it. Sometimes, if one were to act recklessly, the consequences would be extremely terrifying. Of course, if he had a strong enough temperament and strength, he would not have to worry about such a problem. However, Xiao Yang knew his limits. Given his current state, it was better to take less risks. If there were too many variables, it would not be a good thing. The woman stood on the spot and pondered for a while before saying, "There's naturally a difference between the two. If you break through in the secret realm, you won't have to worry about the suppression and counterattack from the 3,000 worlds." Hearing this, the corners of Xiao Yang's mouth curled up slightly. If that was the case, deceiving the heavens and avoiding punishment in the secret realm seemed to be a good thing. However, could this really bring about the benefits that he had expected? Therefore, Xiao Yang was not in a hurry. He continued to listen patiently. Although you can break through safely in the secret realm, I can use the pseudo-spiritual meridian you gave me as a foundation to allow you to reach the martial emperor realm. However, that doesn't mean that you won't be suppressed by the way of heaven. After you leave, the lightning tribulation will become stronger. After all, there's a huge difference between the lightning tribulation that will kill someone who is about to break through and a quasi-martial emperor realm powerhouse, Lu Yin said with a sigh. Xiao Yang nodded slightly. It was not difficult to understand the logic behind this. Of course, if you do this, you'll have more confidence in resisting the lightning tribulation after you leave. However, he wasn't sure what the success rate was. But at the very least, it's still hundreds of times stronger than when you're about to break through, Lu Yun said calmly. These words caused the corners of Xiao Yang's mouth to twitch. If that was the case, then it would be unimaginable. If that was the case, it would be very troublesome. It could be said that the most difficult part for Xiao Yang to break through to the martial emperor realm was how to overcome the tribulation. The 10th martial emperor was not someone who could appear in the 3,000 small worlds. As such, the moment they appeared, the 3,000 small worlds would ruthlessly wipe them out. Of course, if you can survive the heavenly punishment of the 3,000 small worlds, then it will think that it can't kill you and will not disturb you in the future. He could not rule out the possibility that the 3,000 small worlds would still carry out the heavenly punishment in the future. If he made a breakthrough in the martial emperor realm, he would inevitably face these problems at that time. If you go through the tribulation first and then break through, it will be much easier. At the very least, the power of the tribulation lightning will be much weaker. If you don't step into the martial emperor realm, then your strength will naturally be weak, Lu Yin said objectively. This was the problem they were facing, and the choice was in Xiao Yang's hands. After all, he was the person involved and could make the decision. Moreover, the things that the heart of the world could do were insignificant in front of the heavenly punishment. It could be said that in order to step into the martial emperor realm, Xiao Yang had done a lot of preparation. Now that there was a new problem, he naturally had to deal with it carefully. At the very least, after careful consideration, he would be able to make the most suitable choice that he was satisfied with. You don't have to be anxious. There's still some luck that hasn't gathered. After all, how to avoid the heavenly punishment is what we're most worried about. When that time comes, it won't be as simple as killing Su Changtian. Even if your body is strong and you've been tempered by lightning, the heavenly punishment lightning tribulation isn't as simple as ordinary lightning, Lu Yun said softly. Xiao Yang nodded. He was really helpless now. He was now in a dilemma. It seemed that no matter what choice he made, he wouldn't be able to make it perfect. If he were to go through the tribulation now, it would be extremely unsuitable for him in his current state. At the very least, the chances of success were very slim. However, if he were to face it in his strongest state after breaking through, he would have to face the extremely domineering heavenly punishment. When that time came, there would be even more problems. All of a sudden, Xiaoyang was extremely helpless. However, on Xiaoyang's side, the bigger problem was that he only knew about these things from hearsay. He had never seen it for himself, nor had he read about it in ancient books. How to weigh the pros and cons was like an illusion that was hard to understand. Perhaps the heart of the world only knew about it because it was born with it. However, it probably hadn't seen it for itself. The woman in the cloud stood there and didn't continue speaking. That was because she wasn't sure either. That was all she could do, which was to analyze the situation clearly. However, she was helpless as to how to deal with it. During tribulation transcendence, the realm core would naturally ensure that it wouldn't harm one's own vital energy. However, how could the heavenly punishment be simple? Not to mention, what sort of scene was that? It was something that he had never seen or heard of before. If he were to attack rashly, the outcome would probably be extremely terrible. Looking at the young man again, he seemed to have calmed down. His anxiety and worry from before had slowly disappeared. It was as if he had always had a card up his sleeve and was always calm when dealing with things. Perhaps it had something to do with the environment he grew up in, because he had experienced too many life and death battles. He was much more indifferent to everything. Xiaoyang was able to kill his way through even when he was facing strong enemies. He was able to turn the tables, even when he was in a situation where he was sure to die. It was probably because of his countless attempts that he was able to achieve the results he had today. Thinking about this, the heart of the world became much calmer. What was the point of being overcautious? Then let's use our fate to provoke the tribulation, Xiaoyang said with a smile. Chapter 2107. Xiaoyang was never one to be overly cautious. He naturally knew what kind of changes his decision would bring. When faced with the unknown, there were too many uncertainties. So, there was no harm in giving it a try. When that time came, things would naturally go straight when the boat reached the bridge head. If he continued to be timid and couldn't make a decision for a long time, then the only decision he made in the end would be to disperse that portion of fate. If he did that, then wouldn't everything he did before be a joke? Therefore, how could Xiaoyang bear to do that? He could only move forward regardless of the wind and rain. After hearing that, the woman in the clouds nodded slightly. Then, she waved her hand and countless amounts of energy poured into his body. I will use the power of the world to completely heal your injuries. Don't worry, said Lu Yin. Xiaoyang nodded his head, enjoying the endless and mysterious energy that continuously surged into his body. He looked inside himself and found that his broken heart was recovering at an extremely fast speed. Such a miraculous move made him feel extremely comfortable. Even though Xiaoyang's cultivation was high and he had many elixirs in his hands, with such heavy injuries, it would take him a few months to recover to his peak condition if he relied on his own abilities and elixirs. However, what Lu Yin used was the power of the world. As a result, the effects were naturally extraordinary. The broken areas were recovering at a speed visible to the naked eye, which made people gasp in amazement and feel very excited. At the same time, Xiaoyang also felt that the spiritual energy and life force in some parts of the flowing cloud world were decreasing at an extremely fast speed. That was how it was. The heart of the world used its own power to convert the spiritual energy to allow Xiaoyang to recover quickly. This was difficult for him to accept. It's nothing. It's just another barren land. If you can succeed, then what you'll gain won't just be a land of withered glory. Lu Yin explained after sensing something. A martial emperor had an extraordinary meaning to a world. Moreover, the two of them were closely connected. They were bound together for good or ill. Hearing this, Xiaoyang's state of mind became determined again. Sometimes things did need to be sacrificed. However, if it was for better development, then there was no harm in giving it a try. In some of the remote areas of the flowing cloud world, especially those uninhabited places, countless flowers, plants, and trees were withering at the fastest speed. In an instant, there was no sign of life in a deep forest. It was dead silent. After the time it took to drink a cup of tea, Xiao Yang's injuries were completely healed. "You must receive this fate properly," said the heart of the world in a deep voice. Xiao Yang killed Su Changtian not only because he wanted to get rid of the ungrateful people of the flowing cloud world, but also because of the fate of the world. If there was really something missing, then a lot of effort would have been wasted. That luck could be said to be invisible and untouchable. It was just a feeling. However, Xiaoyang was able to sense that the formless luck was indeed very mysterious. It was like a gentle breeze blowing past. The fate seemed to be guided by the heart of the world to become very intimate. It did not resist at all and kept entering Xiaoyang's body. After the time it took to drink a cup of tea, Xiaoyang felt the 9 small spiritual veins in his body start to change. He could no longer suppress it. It was like water overflowing when it was full. It was time for a breakthrough. "Let's go." In the next moment, Xiaoyang left the Middle Mountain secret land and appeared in the sky of the flowing cloud world. The moment Xiaoyang appeared, he felt a few powerful auras surrounding him. He looked over and saw that Mu Yang, Chu Taiyin, and the others were gathered here. When they saw Xiaoyang suddenly appear, they were shocked. What kind of technique was that? It was so mysterious. Moreover, they did not notice it at all. Suddenly, a bold guess appeared in everyone's mind. Could it be that Lord Xiao had reached that level? Was that why he had such a divine ability? At that moment, Mu Yang's breathing became ragged. If that really was the case, it would be great news for the drifting cloud world. "Why are you guys here?" Xiao Yang asked in confusion. Logically speaking, they should be in Baixing City now. "We felt the space here shaking violently, so we came to check it out," Chu Taiyin said. Xiao Yang nodded. Previously, when he fought with Su Changtian, the power that exploded was so terrifying that it caused the entire Middle Mountain secret land to shake. Therefore, it was normal for the space here to shake. "Xiao Yang, your aura is so strong. Did you break through?" Mu Yang asked the answer he wanted to know the most. At this moment, everyone's eyes fell on Xiaoyang. They were filled with anticipation because they knew that if Xiaoyang succeeded, they would have a great chance of going to the 3,000 small worlds. As for them, they would also benefit greatly from this. Whether Xiaoyang reached the Martial King realm or not would affect the future of the flowing cloud world. Therefore, how could they not be excited? Xiaoyang shook his head and said, "Not yet." Immediately after hearing these words, everyone could not help but shake their heads helplessly. His aura was so strong that it was shocking, but he still had not broken through. However, if he reached the Martial King realm, what would it be like? The others did not know, but they knew very well that it was unimaginable. Suddenly, Xiaoyang's face turned serious and said, "Hurry up and return to Baixing City. If you can't do it, take your people and go further away." Suddenly, everyone recalled that Xiao Gongzhu had told them about this before. Once he became the 10th Martial King, the 3,000 small worlds would not tolerate him. At that time, the heavenly tribulation would descend and kill him. The heavenly tribulation was merciless. Under the heavenly tribulation, it would not differentiate between a person and an ordinary person. At that time, wherever the heavenly tribulation passed through, it would only cause misery and suffering. Seeing that Xiaoyang was in such a hurry, everyone responded and immediately turned around and rushed back to Baixing City. After all, there was a formation there. Moreover, they had many powerhouses with them. Therefore, they could still withstand the effects of the heavenly tribulation. The reason why Xiaoyang said that was because he had sensed that thunderclouds were gathering in the sky. His aura was attracting the heavenly tribulation. Chapter 2108. In the Realm of the Gods. The Emperor God was playing chess with Prime Minister Jiang Zhangqing. They fought back and forth, and there was a joyful look on his face. It was obvious that he was having a good time in this game of chess. That was why he looked like this. Jiang Zhangqing, on the other hand, looked like he was drenched in sweat. It was obvious that he was having a hard time withstanding the Emperor God's attacks. That was why he was having a hard time. Beside the Emperor God sat a woman in palace attire. She was staring at the chess game, and there was a faint smile on her lips. It was as if she was very satisfied with the chess skills of the person beside her, or perhaps she had seen through the killing moves and the mysteries of the chess game. On the other hand, Princess Mingzhu sat at the side with a bored look on her face. It was as if she did not want to take another look at the chess game that was being fought to her heart's content. After a few more exchanges, Jiang Zhangqing finally found it difficult to withstand the Emperor God's sharp attacks. In the end, he could only give up and admit defeat. He did not continue. "Prime Minister Jiang, your chess skills have decreased a lot compared to before. Why? Have you been troubled by too many things recently?" The Emperor God teased with a smile after winning the chess game. He immediately felt refreshed. Jiang Zhangqing smiled faintly and said, "I've been idle these days. Perhaps it's because I'm idle that my brain isn't enough to use." Princess Mingzhu, on the other hand, still did not look at the chess game. Instead, she was flipping through an ancient book. If her father had not asked her to come over to learn chess, why would she have come to this place to waste her time? In the end, after reading for a while, she felt that it was boring and stopped reading. She would rather read ancient books from the past. It was much more interesting. The Emperor God did not force her. Since she did not have such thoughts at the moment, there was nothing he could do. In that case, he would just change the method in the future. However, the chess game that he had agreed to with Prime Minister Jiang naturally had to continue. That was why the scene earlier had occurred. "Prime Minister Jiang only gave you a handicap. Look at how pleased you are with yourself," the woman sneered and said. When the Emperor God heard that, he was stunned for a moment. Then he looked at the chess game again. However, he did not see anything. He followed his own train of thought and tried to understand Prime Minister Jiang's technique. However, he did not see anything out of the ordinary. Gave him a handicap? Which handicap? The woman did not point it out and allowed her husband to think about it. Lei Dingtian returned a few days ago. I heard that he left his family's heirloom, the Holy Thunder Hammer, in the Thousand Thunder Realm. He must be one of the younger generations of the Lei family. Jiang Zhangqing suddenly thought of this and smiled. The God Emperor smiled and nodded, saying, "Lei Dingtian is indeed a good child. His strength is not bad, and it seems that his temperament is also good. He must have left the Holy Lightning Hammer behind so that the Lei clan could rebuild the Thousand Thunder Palace." But speaking of which, it was indeed the case. At that time, once we leave, Sword Heart World will not take the lead, and the other worlds will naturally not invade. As long as they can resist the encroachment of the other sects, it is not impossible for them to achieve glory again. Jiang Zhangqing nodded slightly. He also understood that since Lei Dingtian had chosen to leave behind the Holy Lightning Hammer they had been longing for day and night, there must be someone capable of taking on the role. It could be said that the Holy Lightning Hammer had always been the possession of the Thousand Thunder Palace's sect master. Now that Lei Dingtian had joined the God Realm, it was naturally impossible for him to go back and support the Thousand Thunder Palace. His actions could be said to have done everything that he could. One should not forget one's roots. In this matter, Lei Dingtian had done very well. Presumably, Lei Dingtian's return to the Thousand Thunder Realm this time was a warning to those who had hit the Thousand Thunder Palace when they were down. Otherwise, how could he possibly return with peace of mind? Let's not talk about him first. How is the situation in Sword Heart World and Sun Snow World? The God Emperor asked. Jiang Zhangqing thought for a while and said, with the help of the old Prime Minister and the three princes, "It is naturally not a difficult matter. I believe that in less than 3 months the two worlds will be close to our God Realm's territory." The God Emperor nodded. If that was the case, Everything could be considered as within his expectations. 10 years seemed to be a long time, but to them it was equivalent to the snap of a finger. To a martial emperor, 10 years was really nothing. What's more, what they were planning, how magnificent was that? When the three worlds are connected, I am afraid that some conflicts will be unavoidable, Jiang Zhongqing said with some worry. However, the God Emperor waved his hand and said, "Sai, Prime Minister, there is no need to worry about these things. We are only allies. When the time comes, whoever is wrong will be wrong. There is no need to shield them. After all, we of the God realm naturally need to have the demeanor that we should have." Jiang Zhongqing nodded slightly, but his brows did not relax, because this matter seemed to be settled with a single word. But when countless trivial matters were stacked up, it would not be simple. Sometimes, because of some small matters that were not dealt with, when they accumulated, it would be very terrifying. Of course, now was not the time to worry about these things. After all, when they had just started the alliance, both sides were very patient and tolerant, so there would not be too big of a problem. Perhaps others did not need to care, but Jiang Zhongqing, as the Prime Minister of the God Realm, had to think of a way to deal with this matter. Suddenly, the God Emperor and the woman stood up abruptly and looked into the distance. Immediately, Jiang Zhongqing touched his head, helplessly, feeling a little baffled. However, he soon saw that Princess Mingzhu had also stood up, her eyes filled with shock. "Good fellow, I don't think we have sensed such a situation before." The God Emperor's mouth twitched slightly as he said. The woman also nodded slightly and said, "Looks like the 3,000 small worlds are really full of hidden dragons and crouching tigers. What kind of person could cause the heavenly punishment?" When these words came out, even Jiang Zhongqing could not help but gasp. He had read about the heavenly punishment in books. Although there were many situations, no matter which one it was, to be able to cause the heavenly punishment was enough to show how terrifying it was. It could be said that everyone present had never seen the heavenly punishment since they were born. Even in the records, it was a kind of speculation based on one's perception. With such a big commotion, could it be that a new martial emperor has appeared? The woman asked worriedly. The God Emperor nodded slightly and said, "It shouldn't be wrong. This is the heavenly punishment of the great Tao. It looks like the 10th martial emperor might have appeared." When these words came out, Jiang Zhongqing was extremely shocked. The 10th martial emperor, how could it be? Chapter 2109. After ordering Mu Yang and the others to return, Xiaoyang immediately rushed back to North Light City, because if he wanted to fight against Tian Fa, this Northern Light City that he had operated for countless years was his final trump card and confidence. It could be said that North Light City was the place where he had the greatest chance of overcoming the tribulation. However, whether he could succeed in the end was still a question. As for the world core, it had completely disappeared into the ground. It had also begun to gather all the energy in the world, preparing to help Xiaoyang overcome the tribulation and successfully break through to the martial king realm. Xiaoyang floated high in the sky, allowing the strong wind to blow at his robes. He only had one hand behind his back, and he had an indescribable sense of ease. It was as if even in the face of the tribulation, he was still calm and composed. It was as if nothing could shake his determination. No matter how strong you are, as long as I want to do something, even if it means going against the 3,000 small worlds, I will still complete it. This aura of his was even more difficult to shake. Countless thunderclouds were constantly gathering and rumbling, but there was not a single trace of lightning leaking out. Dark clouds gathered and covered the sky. Even the entire flowing cloud realm was plunged into darkness at this moment. Fortunately, they had spoken of this matter in advance, so there was no trouble because of it. Above Baixing City, which was the closest to North Light City, Mu Yang, Chu Taiyin, and the others all stood high in the sky, looking at their master. Because Baixing City was the closest to North Light City, there was a high possibility that it would be affected. Almost all the level 9 powerhouses had gathered there to protect the peace. Boss is indeed boss. Even breaking through to the next level can attract the tribulation. Just standing there, he's really in high spirits. It's fascinating, Baldy said with a smile. Chun Mingho rolled his eyes at him and said, Boss can't hear you. Your flattery is meaningless. So what if he can't hear me? Besides, am I flattering him? I'm just expressing my admiration from the bottom of my heart, Baldy said unhappily. When everyone heard Baldy and Chun Mingho's bickering, they only smiled calmly. Not to mention Baldy. Who else present was not fascinated by such a scene? They wanted to be like that too. They wanted to look down on the world and fight against the entire world with their own strength. However, they did not have that kind of ability. Putting aside their luck, they felt that with their strength, under the heavenly punishment, they would probably end up in ashes in the command room. There was no need to think about anything else. Sometimes cultivation was going against the will of the heavens. Although taking advantage of the situation could allow one to progress faster and more comfortably, was that really the right thing to do? Senior Muyang, tell me, what are the chances of Lord Shao surviving the heavenly punishment? Chu Tain asked with a smile. Muyang shook his head, but did not reply. After all, this was not something that they could speculate about. They had only heard about the heavenly punishment, but they weren't sure about the details. However, they would soon be able to understand because they would be able to witness everything. However, everyone's mood was extremely carefree at this moment. This was because they trusted Xiao Yang very much. They felt that he had overcome all obstacles along the way and had reached a level that could not be underestimated. It was reasonable for him to survive the heavenly punishment this time. Once he succeeded, Lord Shao would become a martial dominator realm expert. At that time, the alliance between them and the God realm would come into effect. At that time, they would be able to travel to the 3,000 middle worlds together and head to a broader stage. This was undoubtedly the best news for them. As such, they could not help but feel even more excited and happy in their hearts. It could be said that they were all looking forward to the arrival of that day. It's not that simple. This talent is different from ordinary heavenly tribulations, Xiao Chongxing said worriedly. Xiao Chongxing also had his own speculations regarding this matter. At the same time, he had paid more attention to this young man of his and understood more about him. No one refuted Xiao Chongxing's words. They were well aware that this was indeed the case. However, Xiaoyang was not an ordinary cultivator. He was an existence that could surpass the limits of King Wu's realm. It could be said that he was the only existence in the 3,000 small worlds. They did not think that Xiaoyang would fail. They felt that he would definitely succeed this time. As the dark clouds covered the entire drifting cloud realm, there was no light at all. This caused many people's hearts to sink, and they even felt incomparably oppressed. Although they knew that this was the heavenly punishment that had descended upon Lord Shao, some cultivators could not help but feel fearful. Under such a dark and gloomy situation, spiritual energy began to become restless and restless. Although they did not feel the heavenly punishment targeting them, under such circumstances, it was inevitable that they would feel uneasy. The current situation seemed to have completely enveloped the drifting cloud realm in darkness, as if the end of the world was imminent. Everyone was in a state of panic. Xiaoyang was still suspended in the air. As the person targeted by the heavenly punishment, he also felt that his aura had been completely locked onto. This sort of feeling was naturally incomparably terrible. In fact, it even made him feel extremely uncomfortable. The spiritual energy in the surroundings also began to change. It was clearly affected by the heavenly punishment, which was why it was like this. However, the heart of the world was helping him stabilize his state of mind. Therefore, he did not feel anxious or anxious. Countless thunderclouds gathered together and roared continuously. It was as if a giant beast was roaring. It was deafening. As time passed, the thunderclouds continued to gather. Of course, more of the power of heaven and earth of the 3,000 small worlds was gathering. The heavenly punishment of the 3,000 small worlds was enough to mobilize an endless amount of power. Feeling more and more power gathering above his head, Xiao Yang's expression became much more serious at this moment. He knew that what he was about to face next would be an even more cruel reality. The heart of the world was already prepared at this moment. It began to echo in Xiao Yang's heart. The thunderclouds above his head gave off an impatient aura. "It's coming!" The heart of the world immediately said after sensing the change. Boom! A thunderbolt suddenly appeared in the dark sky. The thunderbolt was extremely thick. When it appeared, it even lit up the dark land as if it was daytime. It could be said to be extremely powerful, blooming with brilliance and shocking to the soul. Chapter 21:10. When the thunderbolt fell, it could be said to be soul-shaking. Even some of the cultivators thousands of miles away could not help but feel their livers and guts being torn apart when they heard this loud sound. It was extremely painful. There were even some who fell to the ground, trembling uncontrollably. It was a fear that came from their innate nature, a fear that came from their consciousness. They could not control themselves. Even Muyang and the other level, 9 cultivators, subconsciously took a few steps back. Their hearts were filled with fear, and their hands began to tremble. At this moment, after sensing the power of the heavenly punishment lightning, everyone subconsciously held their breaths. At the same time, they could not speak. Their calmness from before was completely gone. Those who did not know were not afraid. Because they did not know how terrifying it was, they did not feel fear. But now that they had experienced it, they were terrified. If this heavenly punishment had struck them, they would have been reduced to ashes several times over by this bolt of lightning. Mu Yang couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva. His heart raced at an extremely fast rate. Beneath the sound of the lightning, no one could hear it. Of course, they did not have the time to observe the people around them. Everyone's gaze landed on Xiao Yang. This leader of the drifting cloud world was extremely powerful, and he was even about to accomplish something that no one had ever done before. It could be said that this was a historical moment. How could they miss it? Now they began to worry about Xiao Yang. Under such a powerful heavenly punishment lightning, could he really survive it unscathed? That was the question in everyone's heart. Even if they didn't come out unscathed, as long as they could survive the heavenly punishment lightning tribulation, it would be an extremely difficult task. Suddenly, Mu Yang's heart was filled with mixed feelings. Was he wrong? Back then, when he discovered the possibility, he should not have told Xiao Yang. If that was the case, he would not be facing such a powerful heavenly punishment lightning. To become the 10th martial emperor of the 3,000 small worlds was to go against the destiny of the Great Tao. In the Great Tao, it was reasonable, and there would not be any problems. However, once you become an anomaly, the Great Tao of heaven and earth will do its best to wipe you out. The heavenly punishment lightning that was sent out was not something to be trifled with. Every strike was enough to take one's life. Even Xiao Yang's hands couldn't help but tremble uncontrollably at this moment. It was not that his mentality was not firm enough. It was just that he was going against the Great Tao, which made him a little unstable. However, he did not cower and charged forward. When everyone saw that Xiao Yang did not dodge, and instead charged towards the heavenly punishment lightning, they were shocked. Could it be that he had lost his mind? Now, instead of relying on the heavenly circulation array in Borealis City to resist, he was using his physical body. This was a little too crazy. Or was he starting to throw his life away? No one knew what Xiao Yang was thinking, nor did they understand. However, Xiao Yang had his reasons for doing so. I can't help you now. Otherwise, the more powerful you are, the more the heavenly punishment lightning tribulation's power will increase. With the toughness of your body, you can withstand the first 3 strikes, Lu Yun said. Xiao Yang only smiled silently. He had already rushed over. A young man facing the great Tao of ruthlessness bravely. If one did not advance, one would fall behind. Since this moment had arrived, there was no reason to avoid it. Only by smashing his head against it and breaking this spell would he be able to last a long time. What else was there to fear? It could be said that Xiao Yang's state of mind was as hard as iron. He had been waiting for this day for a long time. Even though he felt the terror of the heavenly punishment lightning tribulation, he was still excited. His arrival this time was within reason and beyond his expectations. Boom! In the next moment, the incomparably thick lightning directly drowned Xiao Yang's incomparably weak body and disappeared without a trace. Everything was silent. In the darkness, only the white light of the lightning could be seen. It was so dazzling that it was difficult to look directly at it. Immediately, everyone's state of mind fell to the bottom at this moment. What would happen next, under such a tyrannical, heavenly punishment, lightning tribulation? Would Master Xiao still be safe and sound? No one knew because they could not see what was going on in the lightning. Xiao Yang was in the lightning. He gritted his teeth and snorted coldly, allowing the lightning to baptize his body. The destructive power of lightning was the strongest. Therefore, Xiao Yang felt that his vitality was constantly being depleted. Fortunately, his body was tough. Even though this bolt of lightning was enough to turn the entire North Light City into dust, he did not succumb or collapse because of it. He allowed his skin to become charred black and intense pain to come from all over his body. Xiao Yang only gritted his teeth and forcefully endured it. This bolt of lightning lasted for a full 10 minutes before it completely ended. Xiao Yang, on the other hand, was still standing there as if he was not injured at all. Mu Yang and the others saw Xiao Yang standing there. Even though his entire body was charred black, his aura was still very strong. They were instantly relieved. Boss's skin is even more terrifying than a godly weapon? You're fine? Baldy couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air as he asked in surprise. Chu Taiyin nodded with a smile. This guy is a complete monster. I'm afraid that in King Wu's realm, no one can hurt him at all. Hearing this, everyone nodded. Facts spoke louder than words. If everything had not happened in front of their eyes, they would have found it hard to believe. What they saw with their own eyes could not be faked. Because of this, Mu Yang and the others were much more relieved. Under such a terrifying heavenly punishment, lightning tribulation, Xiao Yang could withstand it head-on. Therefore, he would be able to withstand the following heavenly punishment, lightning tribulation. Even though that was only the first bolt of heavenly punishment, lightning tribulation. The power of the heavenly punishment, lightning tribulation, was naturally stronger than the previous one. The power of the next one might be many times stronger than the previous one, or even tens of times stronger. Xiao Yang was naturally very clear about this point. Therefore, with a thought, he immediately used his spiritual energy to heal his wounds. At the same time, he madly swallowed tens of medicinal pills to provide himself with more spiritual energy so that he would be able to withstand the next attack. Resisting the heavenly punishment, lightning tribulation, consumed a lot of energy. In an instant, the second bolt of heavenly punishment, lightning tribulation struck. Chapter 2111. The second god's punishment was thicker and more violent than the previous one. The moment this lightning struck, the entire drifting cloud was filled with the sound of thunder. The sound was so powerful that it was deafening. If it weren't for the fact that Baixing City was protected by the array, some of the weaker cultivators would have died from bleeding from their eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. Even under such circumstances, it was still difficult to bear. One could say that they were scared out of their wits. The god's punishment carried with it the power of the heavens. It was sacred and inviolable. It was terrifying to the extreme. Even someone as strong as Xiao Yang was not feeling well at the moment. His internal organs had been shaken, and he was in unbearable pain. Of course, no matter how calm he was, it was difficult for him to be completely immune to this. On top of that, it was targeting his soul. Xiao Yang waved his sleeves and placed his hands behind his back. Although he looked calm and composed, he couldn't help but feel a little flustered in his heart. under the pressure of the Grand Tao, who would be able to completely keep their heart as still as water. On top of that, the god's punishment was targeting him directly. This feeling was more difficult than Xiao Yang's battle against Han Jingming. It was hundreds of times more terrifying. Humans have emotions and consciousness. Because of their mentality, they will show flaws. However, the Tao is emotionless and will not be disturbed. No matter how you deal with it, the punishment it sends down is set in stone, and nobody can change it. The entire god's punishment once again engulfed Xiao Yang. The power this time was many times stronger than the previous one. It was extremely terrifying. In an instant, before the light from the weapons could even circulate, they were turned into a pile of scrap metal. Among them, there was no lack of weapons of the heavenly realm. From this, it was obvious how terrifying the god's punishment was. It was not something a normal person could defend against. Xiao Yang clenched his teeth as he endured the pain and pain. At the same time, Xiao Yang did not completely endure it. He even borrowed the power of the lightning to refine his body. If he could use the god's punishment well, then the effect of refining his body would be extraordinary. Of course, that was under the condition of success. If he failed, he would probably be annihilated. Since Xiao Yang dared to do so, he naturally had great confidence. It was just a battle to the death. What was there to be afraid of? Not to mention, even the World Core had asserted that the first 3 bolts of heavenly punishment lightning could be completely withstood with just his physical body, so there was no need to worry too much. In fact, the first 3 heavenly punishment lightning tribulations were merely appetizers. What came after was the true killing move, and it was difficult to defend against. After the second lightning tribulation ended, the third lightning tribulation came one after another, once again hitting the young man's body until he was charred on the outside and tender on the inside. Everyone couldn't help but gasp when they saw that Xiao Gongzhu had withstood 3 consecutive bolts of heavenly punishment lightning tribulation without resorting to any tricks. Just how tough was this guy's body to be able to withstand that? He was simply a monster. The toughness of his body was probably even more tyrannical than those top ferocious beasts. Chu Tain, who had fought with ferocious beasts in the North Peak Grotto Heaven for several years, could not help but twitch his mouth. If Xiao Yang stood there and let him hit him, it would be difficult for him to defeat him. This feeling of disparity was even more difficult for him to accept. Back then, when Xiao Yang was in the Devil Realm, he still needed Xiao Yang's help to deal with the Devil Lord. Now he had reached a level that everyone could only look at but not reach. The speed of this monster's growth was too fast and too terrifying. After forcefully withstanding 3 bolts of lightning, Xiao Yang's breathing became hurried, but every time he gasped, it affected the injury on his chest, causing him to grimace in pain. The more it was like this, the more it affected, and the pain was unbearable. In fact, Xiao Yang even smelled a trace of burnt smell. His body was almost cooked under such bombardment. If he hadn't stimulated it with his spiritual power and poison power, his skin and flesh would have been completely destroyed. Even his 8 extraordinary meridians were also bombarded, and some of them were broken. Fortunately, he could barely maintain it with his own strength. You have to be careful in the following lightning tribulation. Xiao Yang's heart rippled. Naturally, the heart of the world was reminding him that he definitely couldn't use his trump card until the end. How many bolts of lightning are there in total? Xiao Yang asked bitterly. The power continued to increase, and he really found it difficult to withstand it now. If there were too many, he might not be able to continue. Logically speaking, the first 3 bolts of lightning tribulation are heaven's might, the middle 3 are destruction, and the last one is destruction of the body and soul. There are a total of 7 bolts, Lu Yin said. Hearing this, Xiao Yang nodded slightly. If there were a total of 7 bolts, it was still within the acceptable range. If there were only 4 bolts left, with his preparations, it was still doable. But that's only for ordinary geniuses. However, you have a total of 9 small spiritual meridians, which is already an anomaly. Perhaps the heavenly punishment will increase because of this, Lu Yun said. Originally, Xiaoyang was still thinking that he had a very high chance, but this bucket of cold water poured over him, making him somewhat helpless. If there were really so many of them, how was he going to defend himself? Soon after, Xiaoyang furrowed his brows and calmed down. It was a good thing to have an idea of what to do. Otherwise, if he used those trump cards early on, he was afraid that his final outcome would be very tragic. Moreover, these trump cards were used to determine life and death in the end. As he spoke, the fourth bolt of lightning had already descended. Xiaoyang cursed in his heart. Just now, he was so focused on asking about the heavenly punishment in the world core that he didn't notice that he was receiving the heavenly punishment. It was already too late to deal with it now, so Xiaoyang could only bite the bullet and charge forward, continuing to use his body to forcefully withstand it. After seeing this scene, everyone was even more astonished. Wasn't this a little too fierce? Under such circumstances, he could still continue to withstand it. It was truly inconceivable. They also didn't understand what this guy was thinking. And what kind of cultivation method did he use to make his body so strong that it could withstand the heavenly punishment, lightning tribulation? It was truly inconceivable. In fact, they even felt that what they were seeing was unreal. This was a lightning tribulation that was enough to make their souls scatter dozens of times. But Xiaoyang was still resisting it. Chapter 21:12. No one could explain why this was the case. However, their thoughts were exactly the same. They hoped that they would be able to withstand the lightning calamity and achieve their dreams. At the same time, he wanted to bring the flowing cloud realm to new heights and achieve unprecedented prosperity. Countless people watched with wide eyes. They also hoped that they could get their own answer. They wanted to see that person achieve great feats. After the fourth tribulation, lightning dissipated. Xiaoyang's figure reappeared. He waved his hands, and it seemed that he had not lost his consciousness or ability from the tribulation lightning. This time it was still a false alarm. It could be said that many people in Baixing City were worried. Even though Xiaoyang's performance was incredibly ferocious, they were still afraid that he would be annihilated by one of the tribulations. If that was the case, the flowing cloud realm would not return to its original state because of his death. However, this was a new peak, and when the external resources were used up, it would go downhill again. Xiaoyang raised his hand and sniffed. You can eat it with some salt, but it's a bit burnt. Under such circumstances, he could still continue to tease. Of course, this was just him trying to find joy in the midst of pain. What he was facing now was endless killing intent and danger. Moreover, every time he endured the tribulation lightning, he had to make careful calculations so that the heavens would not suddenly unleash its power. When the time came, it would stack higher and higher, and in the end it would exceed his limits. Because of this, he used his body to endure it and did not purposely explode with power. The fifth tribulation, lightning, did not seem to be willing to fall behind, and in just a few breaths it descended again. Xiaoyang did not take out any artifacts, and there were no signs that he was going to make a move as he charged over again. Of course, Xiaoyang did not want to use his body to endure the fifth tribulation. Instead, he gathered his will and prepared to use this method to resist. Even though Mu Yang and the others were already used to this kind of thing, they were already used to it. However, now that they saw it again, they could not help but tremble in fear. The power of the tribulations could be said to be stronger than the previous one, and the stacking power was even more terrifying. Now that Xiaoyang was dealing with it like this, how could they not be worried? Is he really going to deal with it like this? Chu Taiying said as the corner of his mouth twitched. He felt that such brash courage was difficult to understand, and he did not know what to say. He's not using the Northern Light City's formation. He's probably using it as the key to victory. Otherwise, if we use our trump card too early, what will happen later? Mu Yang said seriously. Chu Taiying laughed involuntarily. That was indeed the key to victory. However, when would it be the last tribulation? This was also the first time they had seen the heavenly punishment, lightning tribulation. So they didn't know what was going on. Therefore, they could only observe and discuss what they understood. The Baldy touched his bald head and sighed with emotion. Why was the gap between them so big? When the fifth tribulation, lightning, dissipated, Xiao Yang's body fell quite a bit. His vitality seemed to have decreased by a lot. It was obvious that he had suffered greatly under the tribulation lightning. Then a sword light flashed in Xiao Yang's hand, and a thunderfire divine sword appeared in his hand. He had used his body to endure 4 tribulations, and the true meaning of nature arts to block one. The following tribulation lightning would probably be even more terrifying. If he did not make a move now, he might not be able to continue. Not only was it a technical job to prevent the heavenly axiom from noticing one's strength so that the lightning tribulation would not be so terrifying, but at the same time, how to maintain a good state so that one could live a long life was also something that required careful consideration. When the 6th tribulation, lightning, descended, Xiao Yang drew his sword and slashed at it. He used a powerful martial skill to weaken the power of the tribulation lightning. In an instant, the 6th tribulation lightning enveloped the sword chi and the person holding it. Everyone was even more dumbfounded. They really couldn't understand what was going on. In the blink of an eye, the 7th tribulation lightning descended. Formation. After feeling that the tribulation lightning was 10 times more terrifying than before, Muyang also felt threatened. He felt that if they did not support it, many of the younger generation would lose their lives because of it. Several powerhouses of the 9th stage didn't dare to have the slightest hesitation, although they were free to watch the battle before, but now, since the power of the heavenly punishment had affected there by Xing City, it was inevitable that they would take action to protect it. When the 7th tribulation lightning descended, even though it did not fall on the Northern Light City, some of the houses in the city were directly shattered by the deafening sound. From this, one could see how terrifying the power of the 7th tribulation lightning was. This was only the power, not the strength. After Xiao Yang split open the tribulation lightning, his entire body began to tremble uncontrollably. Black blood flowed out from his 7 orifices. However, because his entire body was charred black, it was not so obvious. However, Xiao Yang knew in his heart that his internal organs and meridians had all been impacted because of this. Some parts of his body had even turned into charcoal. He, who had already withstood the 7th tribulation lightning, was now a little blurry. He could not hold on any longer. Let me help you with the 8th tribulation lightning. The world core said anxiously. Xiao Yang had relied on his own strength to hold on until now. It could be said that it was not easy. Moreover, from the world core's point of view, if it did not help, Xiao Yang would most likely lose his life under the 8th tribulation lightning. The previous tribulation lightning was within Xiao Yang's ability to deal with, so the world core could watch from the sidelines and help him analyze the situation. However, now that it was a matter of life and death, if it continued to sit by and do nothing, it was afraid that they would all be seriously injured. Xiao Yang shook his head. It was not clear whether it was because he was delirious or because he wanted to sober himself up, but he seemed very helpless. Although Xiao Yang had already taken countless pills to replenish himself, facing the attack of the tribulation lightning, the consumption was too great. It could be said that he could not make ends meet, especially when his spiritual meridians were bombarded by the tribulation lightning. Xiao Yang was already somewhat powerless. How terrifying was the power of the tribulation lightning! How could it be resisted by the physical body alone? 9 is the limit. Xiao Yang took a deep breath and said, Chapter 21:13. After hearing these words, the world core understood that Xiao Yang didn't want it to help him. He still wanted to face the 8th heavenly punishment alone. Isn't this too risky? The world core asked anxiously. However, Xiao Yang shook his head with a smile and said, Let's bet on whether I can block this heavenly punishment. If I can, we'll soar into the sky. If I can't, Even if you help me with the 8th heavenly punishment, what about the 9th? At that time, we'll die either way. Why don't we bet everything on the highest possibility? The world core was speechless. What he said was indeed correct. 9 was the limit. The 9th heavenly punishment was already the limit. And that would also be the most terrifying one. If the 8th heavenly punishment sensed that there was a sudden addition of power, then the power of the 9th heavenly punishment would increase by several times, or even dozens of times. Are you confident? The world core asked. Xiao Yang could only laugh bitterly. He was already at the point of exhaustion. How could he still dare to say such big words? However, his mind was incomparably firm. If he wanted to live and go further, then he had to block it, even if he couldn't. It could be said that he could only rely on his own willpower to forcibly hold on. At this moment, the 8th heavenly punishment, which had been accumulating power for a long time, fell with a loud bang. When this heavenly punishment fell, in Baixing City, even with the protection of the heavenly circulation formation and several 9th level mighties, all the cultivators below King Wu's realm directly fainted. The heavenly might was brilliant, shaking the soul and terrifying the mind. Xiao Yang's left hand quickly drew a circle, while his right hand began to dance with the sword. Greater teleportation technique. Thunder Prison True Fire. Xiao Yang performed a technique with one hand. At the same time, after the first technique was completed, he immediately began to form seals with the next one. Facing such a heavenly punishment, he could only use all his skills to fight for a chance of survival. He even used all the skills he had learned in his life. This was an important heavenly punishment that concerned his life and death. He had to use all his strength to face it. If there was even the slightest mistake, he would probably become an existence that was annihilated. Even his divine sense would be completely obliterated and cease to exist. Although the greater teleportation technique absorbed a bit of the heavenly punishment, it was soon unable to withstand the bombardment and exploded. It could no longer bear the burden of the heavenly punishment. Countless scarlet and white sword chi couldn't protect themselves under the lightning and were constantly being shattered. It was as if, in front of the general trend, all means were like ants, unable to contend against it. Under the heavenly punishment's destructive power, Xiao Yang seemed insignificant. However, he didn't take even half a step back. Instead, he charged forward as if he was seeking death. When Mu Yang and the rest saw Xiao Yang's actions, they involuntarily sucked in a breath of cold air. They felt that Xiao Yang's actions were a little too crazy. Or could it be that he really wasn't afraid of death, which was why he was acting this way? Very quickly, the heavenly punishment completely engulfed Xiao Yang. At that moment, countless people felt as if everything had fallen silent. It was as if everything had ended. Everything made him feel pale and powerless, lost and helpless. However, when the heavenly punishment dispersed, they saw a black charcoal spasming all over. He couldn't control himself, but he still held the sword tightly. He was unusually determined. Everyone let out a sigh of relief. It was as if they had just survived a disaster. In the end, the result didn't disappoint them. He was still alive, and he had withstood the heavenly punishment. However, everyone's happiness only lasted for an instant. Very quickly, their faces darkened again. This was because the heavenly punishment wasn't over. It was still going on. Right now, Xiao Yang's life was hanging by a thread. If the heavenly punishment were to descend upon him, how would he deal with it? Mu Yang and the others wanted nothing more than to help Xiao Yang block the heavenly punishment. However, in the end, they could only give up on this idea. This was because under such a heavenly punishment, with their abilities, they wouldn't be able to weaken the heavenly punishment at all. Instead, they would die for nothing. Now they were still rational. They knew what they should do. It was the wisest thing to do. Xiao Yang took a deep breath. He wanted to stabilize his body, but he couldn't. Unbelievable! The heart of the world exclaimed. In the eyes of the heart of the world, Xiao Yang had already done something impossible. Such a magnificent feat was incomparably shocking. It was also incomprehensible. This could be described as a miracle. The ninth heavenly punishment wasn't in a hurry to descend. Instead, the lightning clouds continued to gather. All of the energy was gathering. Xiao Yang glanced over. His guess was confirmed. What was about to happen next was the final heavenly punishment. As for the final heavenly punishment, it would gather all of its power. Xiao Yang took a deep breath. Instantly, his mind became much clearer at this moment. Countless people's gazes landed on Xiao Gongzhu's charred body. Whether he lived or died seemed to depend on this final heavenly punishment. Boom! Suddenly, a purple bolt of lightning streaked across the sky. It was only as thick as an arm, but the power it contained was 100 times more than the first heavenly punishment. The destructive power was even more terrifying. If it was aimed at the drifting cloud realm, it would probably be enough to split the entire realm. The remaining area would probably be less than a tenth of the previous heavenly punishment. With a thought, Xiao Yang instantly flashed onto the heavenly cycle orderly formation. He roared and charged forward with his sword. The heavenly cycle orderly formation was activated. All of the energy gathered on his sword at this moment. In fact, more than half of the energy in the pseudo-spirit meridian was sucked away at this moment. Gradually, it reached the bottom. At the same time, many more invisible forces appeared around Xiao Yang's body and attached themselves to his surroundings. This was the power of the realms surrounding his entire body. Boom! The purple lightning struck Xiao Yang's forehead, causing his entire body to tremble for a moment. Then he fell down powerlessly. The purple lightning also seemed to have killed a heaven-defying divergent. It stopped there without any movement, as if it had been frozen. The sword aura within the divine sword seemed to have slowed down by a beat. Then it surged out wildly and slashed at the purple lightning. Boom! Xiao Yang's body fell powerlessly and smashed into the dilapidated North Light City. Dust flew everywhere, and all was silent. Chapter 21:14. The 9 bolts of God's punishment had completely struck down, and the clouds of God's punishment began to disperse. It was no longer as mighty as before. The clouds quickly dispersed, and the darkness was pierced through by the light of dawn. The flowing cloud realm was once again bathed in sunlight. Some cultivators felt as if they had just survived a disaster, and they were extremely excited. The apocalyptic God's punishment made countless people tremble in fear. They were afraid that they would be reduced to ashes under such a calamity. Fortunately, it was all over now. The clouds parted to see the light of day, and the mighty heavenly punishment finally dispersed. Some people even cried tears of joy. They were overjoyed that they had finally made it through this difficult time. The ones who were the most emotional were the cultivators who could not even lift their heads from the God's punishment suppression. In the 100 Prosper City, there were many people who were lying on the ground, bleeding from their 7 orifices. Fortunately, the God's punishment was not purposely targeting them, although their foundations were shaken and some of their realms had even fallen. They had at least kept their lives. Mu Yang and the others were also dispirited. They looked at each other and smiled. The suppression just now was simply too terrifying. The ripples of power that had spread out were even more terrifying. Even with the heavenly cycle orderly formation and their combined efforts, it was still difficult for them to withstand the attacks, especially those who were maintaining the formation. They had suffered quite a bit of damage. Fortunately, they managed to endure it in the end. They didn't collapse under such heavenly punishment and become completely dispirited. In the next moment, everyone's hearts tightened. They had only been affected, and it was already like this. What would happen to Xiao Yang, who had been targeted? Immediately, everyone's hearts were on edge. There was no sound from the North Light City, and no one knew what was going on there. However, they did not feel that powerful power. At that moment, everyone was more or less disappointed. Could it be that he had failed? This kind of ending was even more difficult for them to accept. After working so hard for so long, in the end it was all for naught. Suddenly, Muyang and Chu Tain looked towards the center as well, because they felt the commotion there. Inside the Middle Mountain secret territory, a bolt of lightning struck down. Sand and pebbles flew everywhere, and the ground cracked open. Many ravines appeared. Some of the peaks even crumbled. Even though the lightning hadn't arrived yet, its aura alone was already terrifying and destructive. At the same time, the seal in the Middle Mountain secret land started to crack under the bombardment of the thunderbolts. After weighing the pros and cons of the situation for a long time, the Realm Core decided that the central mountain was already completely barren, and there was no way it could be salvaged. As such, it was better to completely abandon that place and divert most of the power of the tribulation lightning there. Otherwise, if it landed in a flourishing place like the Northern Light City, it was likely that the flourishing place that had been developed over the past few decades would be razed to the ground, becoming extremely dilapidated. The World Heart naturally knew what was more important and what was more important. It had to do this, abandoning the land that had been abandoned for tens of thousands of years, and this place that was surrounded by spiritual energy. The choice was obvious at a glance. However, the price was still rather high. After the land was barren, it could take countless years to recover, but once it was broken, it might really not exist anymore. However, that was how things were in the flowing cloud world right now. If they wanted to quickly increase their overall strength, all they could do was protect the place that was most effective right now. As such, they could only give up on everything else. That's quite a big commotion. Muyang smiled bitterly as he muttered. Chu Tain nodded. They naturally sensed it as well. However, because Xiaoyang had appeared there before, they knew that it was most likely a trump card set up before. Now that they had gone to check it out, there wasn't much point. Right now, their gazes were all on the Northern Light City. They hoped that man could quickly stand up and show them that the flowing cloud world was the victor. However, they were not in a hurry to check it out because they were still afraid that they would see something that they didn't want to see. At least for now, they could still think of some good things. Once they saw it with their own eyes, it would be difficult for them to continue lying to themselves. They were all level 9 experts under King Wu, especially Muyang, who was second only to Xiaoyang. Naturally, he also clearly felt how terrifying the power of the heavenly punishment was. It was not something that ordinary people could withstand. Even if they weren't ordinary people, it would be difficult for them to survive under such a huge commotion. The world was unpredictable, and there were too many unforeseen events. It wasn't something that could be decided with just a few words, and fantasies could become reality. They could only wait here and hope for a satisfactory result. No one said anything. Everyone's thoughts began to change greatly. In the Northern Light City, there were broken walls everywhere, and there were even many shattered doors. A piece of black charcoal fell in the middle of the destroyed plaza, constantly twitching. Under the bombardment of the heavenly punishment lightning tribulation, Xiaoyang had already changed beyond recognition. He no longer looked like a human. Right now, Xiaoyang was in great pain. His limbs and bones were constantly throbbing with pain, making him feel extremely helpless. His consciousness was on the verge of collapse, but he continued to persevere. He knew that if he fell asleep now, all of his previous efforts would be for naught. In fact, he could even sense that something as mysterious as luck was flowing out of his body. Before, Xiaoyang was in perfect condition, and with the help of the World Core, he was able to lock that portion of fate in his body. However, his body was now damaged, and it had become a leaky wall. The fate did not belong to him in the first place, so it would naturally flow out. "You did it," the World Core said joyfully. However, it was not difficult to tell that the World Core had been heavily damaged after resisting the heavenly punishment together, and it was now extremely weak. Xiaoyang smiled. He could not even do something as simple as nodding his head. Even the slightest movement would cause the bone-piercing pain to almost make him faint. His willpower had been worn down by the heavenly punishment, and he had become extremely weak. Who could still be so resolute and not change in the face of endless torture? Suddenly, Xiaoyang thought of the countless expectations he had. The entire flowing cloud realm was on his shoulders, so he had to stand up. Fortune came to the soul. Chapter 21:15. At this moment, countless amounts of spiritual energy quickly gathered and flowed towards the North Light City. Some of the energy seemed to have materialized and appeared milky white. It was very beautiful and tranquil. Those powers were like long dragons, scrambling to be the first to rush to a certain place. The charred youth lying on the square of the North Light City also felt a strange feeling. Although the mysterious fortune was still flowing out, it was followed by an endless amount of power. At this moment, he also felt as if he was lying in an incomparably rich sea of spiritual energy. That warm feeling made his entire body and mind relax, and he was not as tense as before. Everything began to change, especially that incomparably subtle feeling. It made Xiaoyang even more immersed in a very wonderful state. It could be said that it was too wonderful for words. After the divine punishment, such a strange phenomenon appeared once again and flowed towards the North Light City. Instantly, countless people's hearts were filled with hope. The answer was already obvious. Immediately, everyone's hearts were filled with excitement. Some of the cultivators who worshipped him were even crying tears of joy. He did it. In the future, he would lead the flowing cloud world further and further. He was indeed the #1 person in the flowing cloud world. He had always shown that he was invincible. Even in the face of the most severe, heavenly punishment, thunder, tribulation of the 3,000 small worlds, he resolutely resisted it. How many people could compare to him in terms of strength and courage? At the very least, from their point of view, no one could be compared to him. He was like that. From the beginning, he was different from the rest and had an extraordinary background. At the same time, his increasing cultivation was incomparably terrifying. In fact, one miracle after another kept popping up. He changed the flowing cloud world completely, allowing all the cultivators in the world to benefit from it. Not only that, but he also solved all the external problems that the flowing cloud world faced. In the end, he even expanded the flowing cloud world's territory by 1/10. Such a magnificent feat had never appeared in the recorded history of the flowing cloud world. It could be said that the current flowing cloud world had reached an unprecedented peak and flourishing age. Following the appearance of such a phenomenon, they also understood that this was only the beginning and would definitely not be the end. When Xiao Gongzhu truly stepped into that realm, he would have reached an agreement with the God realm. At that time, they would also head to the 3,000 small worlds together and go to an even bigger stage. In Baixing City, a young girl was already crying her eyes out. Previously, when Xiao Man felt the terrifying power of the divine punishment, she believed that the young master would definitely be able to pass it. However, as each bolt of lightning was stronger than the last, she gradually began to feel fear and terror. Why did such a phenomenon appear now? It was similar to how she felt the heavenly tribulation, lightning tribulation, was unparalleled, and it achieved the same result through different means. Under such a situation, they firmly believed that the step had arrived. At this moment, the 9 small spiritual meridians in Xiaoyang's body were like a flood that had broken through a dam. They were continuously spreading to his limbs and bones. In his body, spiritual energy was repairing his body. With regards to this, Xiaoyang did not stop it. Returning to one's natural state was just like that. Without destruction, there can be no construction. This could also be explained. Once these 9 small spiritual veins were scattered, it was caused by luck. Once they gathered together, then he would become a genuine martial king expert. Immediately, Xiaoyang used his mental cultivation method and began to mobilize the spiritual energy, gathering it with a purpose. The spiritual energy contained within the 9 small spiritual veins was enormous. The eruption was even more unimaginable. It was definitely not easy to completely control it. Furthermore, there were some people who had regressed to the 8th level when they were trying to break through to the martial king realm. Because the spiritual veins were scattered, they could not gather together. When the spiritual energy was scattered, then naturally they could only face the awkward situation of their realm dropping. If one wanted to break through to the martial king realm, it was far from enough to rely on the spiritual veins in the body. They needed to absorb more spiritual energy to achieve such an effect. At this moment, the heart of the world quickly mobilized the spiritual energy from other places to the Northern Light City. There were priorities. So what if there was less spiritual energy in a certain place? As long as Xiaoyang could break through to the martial king realm, they would not lose out because of their close relationship. In fact, there would be even greater rewards in the future. In Baixing City, the almighty people who could call the wind and summon the rain in the flowing cloud world were already in tears. As the core of this world, they naturally knew a lot of things. They knew very well what Xiaogong Zhu's breakthrough this time meant to him, and it would bring unimaginable benefits to the entire drifting cloud world. He finally did it. Mu Yang laughed bitterly. His eyes were filled with joy. Previously, Mu Yang was still worried that the method he had found would harm Xiaoyang. He felt that it would make it difficult for him to take even a single step forward. It might even cause him to step into a bottomless abyss. Fortunately, everything was going according to the best plan. The worst situation did not happen. Xiao Chongxing nodded emotionally and said, "It's really good. We old fellows are really getting old." After he finished speaking, Xiao Chongxing even laughed bitterly at himself. There was a difference of thousands of years between them. However, that young man had already reached a realm that they could not hope to reach. It could be said that the fact that they could achieve what they had today was largely due to Xiaoyang. If he had not passed down the method, how could they have reached the 9th level so smoothly? The bald man and Chun Mingho looked at each other and smiled. At this moment, their hearts had become even more determined. Because of Xiaoyang's breakthrough, they felt that it was worth it to join him. When they had first arrived, the flowing cloud world had been so poor and barren. But now, a martial emperor expert that no one had expected had been born. Although he had not appeared yet, they felt that it was only a matter of time. Chu Taiyin's brows were tightly furrowed. However, his eyes were filled with information. It could be said that Chu Taiyin did not seem to care about the changes in the world. However, now that he saw a junior with such achievements, how could he not be envious? Chapter 21:16. The clouds parted to see the light of day. Now, in the entire drifting cloud realm, countless people's hearts were filled with hope and hope. Although the heavenly punishment lightning tribulation was terrifying, it was already over. What they would face next was a whole new world. Xiaoyang was still lying on the ground, but the muscles on his body were beginning to change. His charcoal-like skin and flesh were constantly shedding, while new muscles were constantly growing in their place. The speed was so fast that it could be seen with the naked eye. Furthermore, this was not a forceful recovery through the use of spiritual energy. Instead, it was his own body that displayed such a terrifying, self-healing ability. Pieces of charred skin continued to fall off, and new skin was constantly replacing them. In a short while, the charred skin had completely fallen off, and new skin was rapidly replacing it. It looked incomparably beautiful. Streams of spiritual energy continued to gather, and the originally broken bones, meridians, and internal organs were restored to their original state. This indescribable feeling made Xiaoyang incomparably happy. He could not do anything, and he could only consciously lead the spiritual energy to gather into a vein. At the same time, Xiaoyang could also feel that the spirit vein had already taken shape, and it was constantly being perfected. This was like a human whose bones and meridians had already been completed. As long as flesh and blood grew, they would be a real human. Suddenly, not only did Xiaoyang feel that the spirit vein in his body was gathering, it was as if a spirit vein was rapidly gathering in the ground where he was lying. Although the speed was very slow, as if it was not there at all, he knew that the drifting cloud realm seemed to have changed because of this. Thanks to you, our drifting cloud realm also received some gifts after the heavenly punishment targeted you. It's just that it's hard to say how large this spirit vein can be gathered. The world core replied happily. Now, the world core was also incomparably happy. It had never possessed a world spirit vein before. Even the previous one was also very talented, and his achievements had reached an unimaginable level. However, their alliance was not as grand as it was at the start. Why was this so? Even the world core did not know. However, this was a good thing. Although the pseudo-spirit meridian that Xiaoyang had given him had been completely destroyed in order to withstand the heavenly punishment, it was still not enough. But what does that have to do with anything? That was far from being comparable to a proper spiritual vein. After receiving such a response, Xiaoyang also laughed. After the great calamity, there would be good fortune after extreme misfortune. Misfortune and fortune came hand in hand. This had always been the case. After a great disaster, there would be great fortune. The milky white spiritual energy was endless. No matter how Xiaoyang squandered it, it was inexhaustible. Of course, he didn't dare to be too casual. After all, these were the treasures that the world core had accumulated over countless years. If he were to waste them, it would truly be a waste of God's gifts. Furthermore, the world core was also condensing a spirit meridian, which required an enormous amount of spirit chi. What do you need me to do? Xiaoyang asked. If a world spirit vein really appeared, then it would only be a matter of time before the flowing cloud realm became comparable to the God realm. If that was the case, how could Xiaoyang not think about it? Focus on breaking through, the world core replied. Xiaoyang also smiled calmly. He flew into the sky and hovered in the sky above North Light City, allowing all the cultivators within a radius of 10,000 miles to see him. In the God realm, the God Emperor looked at the ordinary-looking sky and couldn't help but frown. Although the sky looked ordinary as martial emperors, they had a different feeling about it. They felt that an enormous amount of energy and luck was continuously gathering. As for the gathering point, they knew that it was in that direction. But as for the specific location, they did not know. This feeling was very strange, and it also made them worried. It seems that the 10th Martial Emperor is really about to be born, the God Emperor said as the corners of his mouth twitched. After hearing this, Prime Minister Jiang Zhangqing's eyelids couldn't help but twitch. Such a method that went against the great Tao could actually withstand the heavenly punishment and successfully break through? Could it be that the luck of the 3,000 small realms had been completely scattered? There were many possibilities in this, but no one dared to say for sure. This was really too fantastical. A completely impossible thing could not be explained by being unimaginable. It's hard to imagine. I wonder what kind of peerless figure could forcefully open up such a path. For tens of thousands of years, many of our predecessors in the God realm have worked hard, but they couldn't do it, the woman in the palace gown said with a bitter smile. The God Emperor also laughed involuntarily. As the monarch of the God realm, the only existence at the peak of the 3,000 small worlds, he knew very well that in the past tens of thousands of years, countless seniors had tried this, but in the end, they all died depressed deaths. Later on, some seniors could only ascend to the middle realms alone to free up their luck and give their juniors a chance. If it wasn't for this, how could the new generation have achieved what they had today? Back then, the God Emperor had used a total of 500 years to try, but in the end he still failed. At this moment, the God Emperor really wanted to see what kind of ferocious person could do such a magnificent thing. Previously, Princess Mingzhu was also extremely shocked. Then, a trace of loneliness flashed across her eyes. She was known as the #1 genius in the God realm for tens of thousands of years. In terms of talent and fortune, she was even above her father, the God Emperor. However, she couldn't break through the shackles. She had only been able to step into that realm when there was a vacancy. But now, there was someone who had done something that she couldn't do. If that was the case, then his aptitude would be nothing more than a joke. What top of the 3,000 small realms? It was just a joke. It's a pity that second brother isn't here. Otherwise, it would be best if he could go and check it out. The God Emperor laughed bitterly. The woman in the palace gown smiled faintly and said, "I'll go." The God Emperor looked to the side and smiled. If his wife went, he would naturally be relieved. However, I have a thought. Husband, do you think that it could be Xiaoyang who completed this heaven-defying feat? The woman in the palace gown said with a smile. The moment these words came out, Princess Mingzhu felt as if she was struck by lightning. The God Emperor laughed out loud. It was possible. Chapter 21:17. If that's the case, then there's no need to investigate further. Once I ask, the results will naturally come out. The God Emperor laughed out loud. If it was really him who had accomplished such a magnificent feat, then their alliance would naturally be fulfilled. By then, they would be able to advance to a middle world together. If the person who had become the 10th martial emperor was really Xiaoyang, then it was enough to prove how terrifying his talent was. Such a person naturally needed to be roped in with all their might. He could even disregard and go against the fortune of the 3,000 small worlds. It was clear how terrifying his ability was. To them, the middle world was filled with countless unknowns, and many things were not within their control. Therefore, the God Emperor had formed an alliance with the other worlds, so that one more person would be more power. By then, if they had the help of a heaven-defying cultivator, then even if they went to a middle world, it would be equivalent to giving their world an extra layer of protection. When the woman heard that, she smiled faintly, and a trace of bitterness flashed across her eyes. Princess Mingzhu's expression changed drastically at that moment because she found it difficult to accept such a thing. All this time, she had been known as the favored daughter of the heavens, who was favored by the 3,000 small worlds. However, compared to that person, wasn't the difference a little too great? Princess Mingzhu had always been the favored daughter of the heavens, and she was also favored by the heavens. Even though the drifting cloud world and the God realm were very far apart, Xiaoyang was unable to obtain that portion of fortune. Instead, he gave it to Princess Mingzhu immediately. Sometimes, one's luck and aptitude only determined one's bottom line. As for where the bottom line was, it depended on various aspects. The woman turned her head and saw that her daughter's mood had become very low. She also sighed helplessly. Now that things had come to this, it could be said that it was unexpected. Princess Mingzhu had her own pride since she was young. She had always been high and mighty among her peers, far surpassing those of the same age. However, at that moment, someone had done something heaven-defying and had even succeeded. How could she remain calm? Naturally, the disappointment in her heart was unavoidable. The woman did not know how to comfort her. Or perhaps not saying anything now was the best choice. After all, everyone's state of mind was different. After the Divine Emperor used the Pisces token to send the message, he did not receive a timely response. Instead, he kept pacing back and forth on the spot as many thoughts kept surfacing in his mind. As for who this 10th martial monarch might be, if it wasn't Xiaoyang, how could they rope him in and make him work for the God realm? In the eyes of the God Emperor, the more monsters there were, the better. Furthermore, the God realm was completely capable of providing for them. The God Emperor had always been very broad-minded because he was always thinking about great things that would last 1,000 years. As for talents, the more the better. Of course, it was fine if some people were unwilling. However, if they dared to harm the interests of the immortal realm, then they would have to pray for good luck. For example, the Greenly realm could only end up in a state of decline. When Jiang Zhangqing saw how anxious and agitated the God Emperor was, he straightened his face and said, "God Emperor, why don't you let me go and investigate?" The God Emperor waved his hand and rejected him directly. Jiang Zhangqing had not cultivated to the level of a martial monarch, so naturally he could not sense the other party. Furthermore, in the eyes of the God Emperor, although there were countless strange people in the 3,000 small worlds. There are very few who could go against the heavens and succeed. That was something that the God realm could not achieve even after thousands of years. The reason why Jiang Zhangqing had not broken through to the level of a martial monarch was very simple. Back then, the old prime minister had said that he could break through the sky. At that time, fate would naturally be set aside and he would be able to take the position. However, at that time, Jiang Zhangqing was so proud that he did not want to do that. He wanted to be the first person to break through to the level of a martial monarch without relying on fate. However, who would have thought that after thousands of years, he would not be able to break through to that level? Instead, his complexion had aged and he looked like an old man. Jiang Zhangqing had spent an unknown amount of time and effort on this matter, but now someone had beaten him to it. It could be said that Jiang Zhangqing was the most emotional. At this moment, his expression had become much more dispirited. Xiao Yang hovered high in the sky. At this moment, he had completed his breakthrough and successfully stepped into the level of a martial monarch. The charred skin had completely fallen off. His skin looked like that of a baby. It even emitted a bit of radiance and was very dazzling. Xiao Yang closed his eyes. He felt the changes in the entire world, and the corners of his mouth curled into a smile. Everything began to go according to his plan, and there were even many unexpected surprises, which made him even more excited. He only needed to sense a little, and no place in the flowing cloud world would be able to escape his eyes. Now, what he saw was the prosperity of the drifting cloud realm. Under the emotions of surviving a disaster, there was even more peace and harmony. Orioles flew and grass grew. All living things came back to life. It was probably going to be like this. At the same time, he also felt that the world's spiritual pulse in the heart of the world was beginning to take shape. Although the speed was very slow, it was still being perfected bit by bit. Then, Xiao Yang clasped his hands together and plunged into the earth's core. He also wanted to try and see if he could perfect the world's spiritual pulse. When Mu Yang and the others saw Xiao Yang appear again, the huge stone in their hearts was completely lifted. Originally, they were still fearful and worried that Xiao Yang would not be able to survive this calamity and would end up dead in the end. Fortunately, he succeeded. Moreover, his aura had become even more powerful than before. His strength was so strong that it was unbelievable. In such a situation, they also understood that all the risks had been taken, and the difficulties had been overcome step by step. Therefore, the rewards that should be repaid naturally fell on Xiao Yang. Xiao Changxing's face was covered in tears. The legendary realm had been achieved by his junior. It could be said that he was the most excited person now. At the same time, they all understood how important this realm was to Xiao Yang. Chapter 2118. 3 days later, everything returned to normal. The news of Xiao Yang successfully breaking through to Martial King quickly spread through the entire drifting cloud world. In that short period of time, all the people of the drifting cloud world began to cheer. This was because it was a legendary realm. If Xiao Gongzhu could reach it, their drifting cloud world would no longer have to worry about being harassed by other worlds. However, a portion of the core forces were even more excited because they knew how significant it was for Xiao Gongzhu to reach Martial King. It could be said that what they cared about the most was how to break through to the 3,000 medium worlds. Although Xiao Yang had such ability, the overall strength of the flowing cloud world was too weak. Perhaps in other aspects, there were still many places where they needed to rely on help in order to be able to achieve what they wanted. Although Xiao Gongzhu had broken through, he did not show himself, nor did he pass on his teachings. Instead, he had vanished. This filled many people with doubts. Since he had succeeded, how could he have mysteriously disappeared? Could it be that Lord Xiao had already shattered the void and left by himself? At that moment, rumors sprang up everywhere. In particular, some people with ulterior motives began to spread rumors without restraint in order to sway people's hearts. If it were before, the other worlds would definitely become restless after hearing that Xiaoyang had disappeared. However, they no longer dared to act rashly now. The current drifting cloud world was no longer the same as before. Mu Yang and the others found it rather strange. Xiao Gong Zhu had vanished just like that, and he did not even leave behind a single message. It was inevitable that they would find it rather strange. However, they firmly believed that Xiaoyang would never abandon them and leave by himself. As a result, a few days later, Mu Yang, Chu Tain, and the others brought everyone back to Borealis City. They were prepared to come back and check out the situation. When the various experts set foot in Borealis City, they discovered that the surroundings were in ruins. Countless buildings had been destroyed. It was a very tragic sight. If all the buildings had been destroyed, they would have been able to make their way through. However, there were a few buildings that were still intact. If they were torn down and rebuilt, it would be quite a heartache. Sun Dishing and Sun Yukai felt their hearts ache when they saw the North Light City in such a mess. At the same time, they felt that their heads were about to explode. It was an extremely troublesome matter to repair the main city. Furthermore, it was hard to count the losses now. I didn't expect that the spirit energy of that pseudo-spirit vein has been completely drained. Mu Yang looked at the center of the heavenly cycle orderly formation and couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air as he spoke in disbelief. After hearing these words, everyone's expression immediately became very ugly. If that was the case, then the Northern Light City's heavenly cycle array could be considered to have been destroyed. After sensing it for a bit, he found that it was indeed the case. There was no longer any spiritual energy here. Everything had returned to normal. Qian Guangqi smiled bitterly and said, "This heavenly punishment destroyed the place that we have been managing for decades." Hearing Qian Guangqi's teasing, Old Master Xiao, Lin Shiyan, and the others also laughed, but it was from the bottom of their hearts. As long as Xiaoyang could succeed, what was the loss of these things? Perhaps these things would be of great use to them, but they couldn't compare to Xiaoyang. Furthermore, as long as Xiaoyang's strength could reach a higher level, these things really wouldn't be much, and there would be more and better things to take root under their feet. As everyone spoke, they all laughed. Now, the joy in their hearts came from the bottom of their hearts, especially after they felt Xiaoyang's aura, which made them even happier. All the hard work he had put in had finally paid off. Under such circumstances, they could be said to be incomparably happy. In fact, Sun Dishing, Sun Yukai, and the others directly started to distribute their wealth. It could be said that everyone was celebrating. Even Mu Yang was in a very good mood. When he saw a young man, he felt that he was pleasing to the eye and directly let him join the sect, saying that he would personally teach him in the future. Immediately, the disciple was so happy that he fainted. But one had to know who Mu Yang was. Thousands of years ago, he was the #1 person in the drifting cloud realm. Even now, his status was still respected, and his strength was only below Xiaoyang's. That disciple's cultivation wasn't even at King Wu's level. Xiaoyang entered the earth's core and took out all the good things that he had collected for many years. He refined them and guided the power, quickly and gently pouring it into this world. This was the only thing he could do. He wanted more power to remain in this world. Only by doing this could he help the heart of the world form the spirit vein more stably. After a few days, the spirit vein was more than half complete. Looking at the small world spirit vein, Xiaoyang couldn't help but fall into deep thought. The difference between this spirit vein and the one in the god realm was like the difference between a small snake and a giant python. However, after thinking about it, Xiaoyang was able to accept it. One had to know that before this, the drifting cloud realm was known for being barren. There was no such thing as a world spirit vein. But now there was one. That was a good thing. Sometimes, if you insist on too much, then there's no meaning. Furthermore, as long as the heart of the world could form the spirit vein, then it would become a possibility. Or perhaps it could be said that this was a kind of hope. As long as the spirit vein was successfully formed, if it was nourished well, there was a possibility that it could grow stronger. But this possibility was very small. A world spirit vein and a spirit vein in a cultivator's body were two different things. Furthermore, it was definitely not an easy task to nurture the world's spirit veins. The divine world was extremely powerful, and the Emperor God's methods and abilities were endless. However, he could only feel the spiritual vein slowly weakening. There was nothing he could do but wait helplessly. It could be said that it was because of this that the God Emperor was even more anxious. He hoped that he could go to the middle world as soon as possible and find some possibility there to change the situation. Another 7 days passed, and the spirit vein in the drifting cloud realm was successfully formed. At the same time, many cultivators in the drifting cloud realm could feel that the surrounding spiritual energy had changed again. It was denser than before. Chapter 21:19. Everyone was well aware of why this happened. It was likely that Xiao Gongzhu had used a great method to change the world after breaking through. That was why such a situation had occurred. The change in Borealis City was a precedent. This time, many cultivators were even more shocked because no one could have imagined that the spirit chi in the entire flowing cloud world would become denser, and not just in one place or one place. Immediately, the sound of jubilation shook the heavens. Countless people's reverence for Xiao Gongzhu had become even stronger. In fact, it was not an exaggeration to describe it as fanaticism. He had become the belief of countless young cultivators in this world. A real man should be like Xiao Gongzhu, quelling foreign troubles and strengthening the realm. Such words had become the goal of many cultivators in the drift cloud realm. As long as they could fulfill these simple words, they would have no regrets in their lives. Xiao Yang returned to Borealis City in a low-key manner. His small courtyard had been damaged by the heavenly punishment. Although some parts were cracked, it was still usable. Moreover, his courtyard was one of the first to be repaired, so it could be said to be brand new. When Lil Man saw his young master return, he was so excited that tears streamed down his face. He was overjoyed. Sun Dishing and Sun Yukai continued to direct the operation of the entire world and were on standby at any time, waiting for Xiao Gongzhu's orders. The two of them were indeed capable. When Xiaoyang was helping the world core condense the spiritual vein in the Earth's core, they had begun to repair the damaged Borealis City. By now, more than half of it had been repaired. Perhaps it was because of the heavenly punishment, but under such pressure, Chu Taiyin and Qin Mingho also felt a little emotional. Therefore, they went into closed-door cultivation again and prepared to break through to a higher realm. Although everyone knew that becoming a martial emperor was an extravagant hope in the 3,000 small worlds, it was still an extravagant hope. However, it was different in the middle world. Now, what they needed to do was to work hard to reach the standard. When the opportunity came, they would be able to seize it and not be helpless. After chatting with Xiao Man for a while, Xiaoyang also walked into the meeting room. When Xiaoyang sat down in the meeting hall, Sun Dishing, Sun Yukai, Qian Guangqi, and the other backbones immediately rushed over and sat down in batches. They clearly knew that since Xiaoyang had broken through to the martial dominator realm, it meant that they had reached an agreement and something big was about to happen. Even Mu Yang and Xiao Chongxing went over. They had many questions in their hearts and wanted to clarify them. The core strength and people of the entire flowing cloud world were all gathered here. The decision of any one of them was enough to shake the entire flowing cloud world. Chu Taiyin and Chen Mingho were absent from this meeting because they were in seclusion. Good lad, I didn't expect you to really do it. Mu Yang laughed out loud. With regards to Xiaoyang, this little fellow, they had never felt any great pressure because of his cultivation level. Of course, it was also because of his kindness that they did not worry about offending him. Thank you for your advice, senior. Otherwise, I would still be like an ant on a hot pan, not knowing what to do. Xiaoyang also stood up and bowed to Mu Yang. Mu Yang called out when he saw this and immediately helped him up. I can't accept your courtesy. You are the leader of the flowing cloud world. How can you bow to an old man like me? Mu Yang said in an unfriendly tone. Xiao Yang smiled and said, "Why can't I?" To Xiao Yang, if Mu Yang had not done his best to collect ancient books to find the method for him, he would probably still be racking his brains trying to come up with a solution. How could he have reached his current cultivation level? Of course, their temperaments were somewhat similar. With regards to this small interlude, they directly laughed it off and did not intend to continue entangling with it. Ji Fei looked at Xiao Yang and the other heroes, and a trace of loneliness flashed across his eyes. He felt that he had come to repay the debt of gratitude and would be a timely help. Who would have thought that in the end it would only be icing on the cake? After chatting for a while, everyone started to get down to business. I've already spoken to the God Emperor about my breakthrough. As such, our alliance with the God Realm is now in effect, Xiao Yang said in a very serious tone. When everyone heard this, they smiled. They knew that everything was about to begin. Ji Fei especially understood what it meant to form an alliance with the God Realm. When he came to the flowing cloud world, he felt that the best-case scenario for him was to help Xiao Yang become a medium world in a few thousand years. As for the worst-case scenario, he could only die in the 3,000 small worlds because he wanted to repay the debt of gratitude. But now, even the best-case scenario was something that Ji Fei could not imagine. In other words, we can become a medium world together with the God Realm. Mu Yang swallowed his saliva and said excitedly. Xiao Yang nodded his head slightly and confirmed this question. Since the alliance had been formed, they would naturally have to advance and retreat together. However, it is hard to say whether we will succeed this time. Ji Fei said in a low voice. After all, it had always been a few thousand times, or even tens of thousands of times more difficult than a cultivator's. No matter how much planning was done, if there were unexpected changes, there would be many possibilities. When the time came, failure was not impossible. So, we can announce this to the world first, and let every cultivator in the flowing cloud world know. Xiao Yang said. Sun Dishing nodded in agreement. He naturally understood this principle. Telling them now would allow them to adapt and accept it, so that they would not cause any more trouble later. Furthermore, their experiences would be revealed in torrents. How could they not tell them all? Also, call back all the disciples who are out training. Of course, those who do not want to leave the 3,000 small worlds can leave the flowing cloud world and go to other worlds. We will not force this matter. Xiao Yang thought for a moment and said. When everyone heard Xiao Yang's words, they could not help but laugh. Becoming a medium world was such a good thing. Who would reject it? After all, going to a broader stage meant that there would be more opportunities for him to perform. That is not a problem, but how much time do we have? Sun Dishing asked. 1 year. Chapter 2120. After Sun Dishing found out about the time, he began to calculate what he needed to do. When they found out that this was the longest flexible time and that could be changed at any time, everyone felt helpless. Fortunately, Xiao Yang had already ordered the cultivators of the flowing cloud world not to go out and train without permission. Therefore, the number of people who entered and left was extremely small. For example, Qian Guangqi, who didn't stay in the flowing cloud world for long, would go out and train to increase his strength. Similarly, he stayed in the North Light City for a few years without moving at all. After all, under the general trend, some things would start at any time. When the time came, it naturally wouldn't stop because of anyone's absence. Of course, if that person was Xiao Yang, then it would stop. However, other than him, who else had the qualifications to do so? Then they began to discuss some things. Under such a general trend, how should they let the entire flowing cloud world know about this without causing panic or arrogance? How should they let everything pass smoothly without causing any trouble? After discussing the problem, the next problem was how to integrate into the God Realm, Sword Heart World, and Sun Snow World without causing any conflict with the other 3 worlds. Soon after, Ji Fei stood out and explained the taboos of the 3 worlds in a rough manner. As long as they respected each other, there wouldn't be many sparks. Of course, if you insisted on doing things your own way, then there was no other way. As a genius from 1,000 years ago, Ji Fei had traveled to many worlds. In addition, he was originally from the Sun-Snow world, so he was familiar with the Sword Heart world and the Divine world. Therefore, his explanation was very clear, and the context was even more complete. This meeting didn't end until midnight, and everyone slowly dispersed. As for the details that hadn't been finalized, they were completely left to the two heroes of the Sun family to decide. On the other hand, the Baldi and the Shao clan's great master were helping out. In short, everyone in the North Light City was busy. Only Xiaoyang, after finalizing the general direction, didn't continue to interfere with other things. Xiaoyang stood on the newly built plaza and looked at the fake spiritual vein that had been completely destroyed. He could not help but sigh in disappointment. Now, North Light City seemed to have once again returned to its previous lack of distinguishing features. Ji Fei stood at the back and said, "I can feel that there seems to be a new spirit vein growing below." When Xiaoyang heard this, he turned his head and looked back. A trace of gloominess flashed across his eyes, but it disappeared in a flash. Ji Fei had been to the God realm before and had also sensed what a spirit vein was. Naturally, it was not difficult for him to detect the recent changes that had occurred in the flowing cloud realm. Adding on the various signs and inferences, the answer naturally became incomparably clear. "I really didn't expect you to be so generous. It's really admirable, as expected of my benefactor," Ji Fei said and gave him a thumbs up. In Ji Fei's eyes, this young man had already reached a respectable level. You couldn't understand his thoughts and actions, but it was this seemingly unreasonable behavior that created countless miracles. "Looks like you're not simple either," Xiaoyang said with a smile. At this moment, Xiaoyang had already realized that he still had to think carefully about the matter of the spirit vein being born in the flowing cloud realm. He had never mentioned this matter before, but since Ji Fei had mentioned it, it obviously wasn't that secretive. How precious was the world's spirit vein! There were only a handful of people in the 3,000 small worlds who possessed it. If it were to be exposed, trouble would be unavoidable. With Xiaoyang's current strength, he could do whatever he wanted in the 3,000 small worlds. There was no need for him to worry at all. However, he was not afraid of thieves stealing, but he was afraid of thieves remembering. The God realm. After receiving Xiaoyang's reply and receiving accurate information, the God Emperor's face was filled with shock. Although they already had some guesses in their hearts at the very beginning, they still had some guesses. However, in the end they weren't certain. When the news came more than 10 days later, it was a little unexpected. "Great, great." Then the God Emperor came back to his senses and said, repeatedly laughing loudly. The person that he had been trying his best to rope in all this time had made a shocking move. Back then, the conditions that the God Emperor had given Xiaoyang were originally difficult to achieve. Moreover, after Han Jingming's portion of fate was taken by Princess Mingzhu, his chances were completely gone. However, now he had done it. He had become the 10th martial king and changed the fate of the 3,000 small worlds. Even the god's punishment, which countless people were afraid of, was blocked by him. Looks like this young man is indeed extraordinary. I'm rather interested in his master, who has never appeared in the 3,000 small worlds, the woman in the palace gown said with a smile. When the God Emperor heard this, he could only laugh bitterly. He had always known the 9 martial kings like the back of his hand. As for who Xiaoyang's master was, he really wasn't sure. Since Xiaoyang was so powerful, it wasn't impossible for his master to be even more heaven-defying. However, they were now allies. There were some sensitive issues that couldn't be deliberately dug up. Emperor Qin had tried to find out more about Xiaoyang's master in the drifting cloud world, but he had never found out who his master was. In fact, he couldn't even find the slightest bit of information. Therefore, this had become a mystery. No one knew whether Xiaoyang's words were true or false. "Then this time should I go and lend a hand, or what?" the woman in the palace gown asked. The God Emperor shook his head and said, I think Mingzhu is the most suitable person to go." When he said this, the woman in the palace gown's expression turned extremely ugly. "You know that Mingzhu's state of mind has some flaws because of this matter. Now that you're asking her to go, aren't you afraid that the flaws will grow bigger?" The woman in the palace gown took a deep breath and said in a deep voice. Back in the palace, they had already felt the change in Princess Mingzhu, but they didn't point it out. Of course, the most important thing was that they didn't know who the heaven-defying person was at that time. After that, the God Emperor wanted to go and check, but he couldn't sense the martial king's aura. Therefore, he had no choice but to give up. The woman knew her daughter very well. This method was a little too extreme. The God Emperor shook his head and said, "That's why we need her to face it head-on." Chapter 21:21. Since most of the matters had been settled, Xiaoyang didn't show his face again. He returned to his own house to rest. With the help of the two heroes of the Sun family as well as many friends, it was naturally easy to settle some of the small details. Now, there was still no news from the heart of the world. This made Xiaoyang a little depressed. After all, at this juncture, without its help, they would have to go through a lot of trouble. The celestial realm had also replied. Since the preconditions between them had been met, the alliance between them would naturally come into effect. The God Emperor told Xiaoyang that they needed to push the drifting cloud realm to the God realm and connect it. This was the only way to become a middle realm. A martial emperor was enough to shake a small realm. However, to push it over completely was not an easy task. Therefore, the two martial emperors had to work together to achieve this. Also, they needed some arrays to support it. As for the arrays, Xiaoyang didn't need to worry. The God realm would provide them. Therefore, Xiaoyang only needed to wait for the God realm's experts to arrive. However, to Xiaoyang, if the heart of the world woke up and could help him, then this matter would be much simpler. Of course, even without the help of the heart of the world, Xiaoyang could continue to wait for the God realm's experts to arrive. When the three kings finished what they were doing, they would also come to help. After thinking about it for a long time, Xiaoyang stopped thinking about it. He took out all the things Su Changtian left behind and began to count them. In the end, he was greatly disappointed after doing a head count. This was because all magic tools with spiritual energy had now become scrap metal. These things, to ordinary people, were godly weapons. However, to cultivators they were just decorations. They were completely useless. As for pills and elixirs, not even a single dregs could be found. Of course, this wasn't strange. In the middle realm, there was no spiritual energy to replenish. Su Changtian had to do this if he wanted to maintain his livelihood. In those tens of thousands of years, it was not easy for him to be able to struggle at death's door for so long. However, it was fortunate that he was still alive. Otherwise, it would not be easy for Xiaoyang to break through to the martial emperor realm. However, there were quite a number of ancient martial arts manuals left behind, and they were all still intact. However, upon closer inspection, some of the words were still blurred. Without the support of spiritual energy, these things would naturally start to decay like ordinary objects. This was just a process. Perhaps it was because Su Changtian placed too much importance on it, so he extracted the spirit chi of these things in the end. Thus, they were not as badly damaged as the other magic tools. From the words on it, Xiaoyang also learned about the situation of the flowing cloud world tens of thousands of years ago. Although there were only a lot of fragments, it was still possible to piece together a rough idea. Tens of thousands of years ago, the drifting cloud realm could be considered one of the most outstanding of the 3,000 small realms. They even had as many as 3 martial emperors. From this, one could see how terrifying they were. Then Su Changtian appeared. Within 100 years, he was already famous, and everyone thought highly of him. As expected, he became the youngest martial emperor in the drifting cloud world. He even received the favor of the heart of the world and became the ruler of the drifting cloud world. As for the demon world and the demon world, they were suppressed by them. However, later on, for some reason, Su Changtian suddenly changed his personality and did a series of strange things. He angered the heavens and the people. In the end, the powerhouses of the drifting cloud world were divided into two factions and began to attack and suppress each other. This situation lasted for tens of years. After the great battle, the drifting cloud world lost all its powerhouses. Su Changtian broke through the void and left. Then there was the chaos caused by the clone that Su Changtian left behind. All of the records ended here. As for what happened after that caused the drifting cloud world to become like that, it was still a mystery that King Wu, a cultivator of the 5th level, was enough to dominate. After a long while, Xiao Yang continued to count. At the same time, he realized that the techniques that were left behind were still in good condition. Of course, what surprised him the most was that the 1st and 2nd volumes of the art of great teleportation were in his hands. Now he had found the missing part. Although the 3rd scroll in Xiao Yang's hands had also become his trump card and had improved many of its flaws based on his experience, he was still very clear about the flaws in it. But now he was able to perfect it. If he could master it thoroughly, it would have an even more unbelievable effect. To Xiao Yang, becoming a martial emperor was the biggest gain. The completion of the art of great teleportation was really icing on the cake. After checking all the techniques, Xiao Yang summoned Xiaohua and threw Su Changtian's body to him to devour. Even though Su Changtian had been trapped for tens of thousands of years, his body was still a good supplement to Xiaohua. Ever since Xiaohua had devoured black fire and obtained its talent, he could not only merge with similar flames, but he could also devour anything that had a spirit to strengthen himself. Of course, Hua wouldn't be as greedy as Black Flame, wanting to devour everything no matter what. After Xiaohua swallowed the body of a martial emperor, it jumped a few times in joy and went to digest its meal. In the following days, Xiao Yang returned to his peaceful state. He began to focus on studying the first 2 volumes of the art of great teleportation. Now that a tall building had been built, he still had to dig the foundation. This was not an easy task. The profoundness and importance of this was even more difficult to explain in a few words. In fact, due to the fact that he had completed it himself, it had led to a preconceived notion. It was not an easy task to correct it. Therefore, during this period of time, Xiao Yang's heart was filled with incomparable pain and suffering. Such days continued for several days before Xiao Yang felt rather helpless. In the end, he had no choice but to put it aside for the time being. More haste, less speed. This was the principle. Now, the more he thought, the more he would rush to do something bad. Sometimes, if he felt that the road ahead was getting difficult, he might as well slow down. Who knows, he might even discover something unexpected. Therefore, Xiao Yang began to pass down the technique again. He was prepared to study the old and learn the new, to complete the process. Chapter 21-22. Xiao Yang had been using this method to learn new things. This was one of the reasons why he was so insistent on passing down techniques. If he imparted the technique, there would be many cultivators in the flowing cloud realm who would benefit from it. Their strength would also increase by quite a bit to the entire flowing cloud world. This kind of improvement would be a huge leap. Since he could benefit from this, why wouldn't he do it? Sometimes, when one's cultivation level is high, one's status is different. Perhaps some unintentional actions are enough to change the entire world. Therefore, there were times when one had to think carefully before taking action, or else it will cause a lot of commotion. When the time comes, good things can turn into bad things. But if passing down techniques can benefit both sides, then they can do it. Plus, this way, they can build up some friendships. Even if there comes a day when he is no longer in the flowing cloud world, then his friends will receive enough respect because of this. 7 days of passing down techniques passed in the blink of an eye. Xiao Yang had also learned a lot from the first 2 scrolls of the great teleportation technique. However, he was still a bit away from mastering it. He was not in a rush. As long as he learned the basics, then it would be much easier to get to the next level. What came next was a giant project that would take up a lot of time. He would need to spend a lot of time training. Therefore, he could put it aside for now. During this time, many cultivators who left the flowing cloud world to train had been called back. As for some, they had completely lost contact with them. After all, when one cultivates in the outside world, one is responsible for their own life and death. Nobody can predict what will happen. At the same time, some cultivators sneaked away. They thought they were very smart, but they couldn't escape Xiao Yang's eyes. After these people left, they were very proud and thought they had escaped death. Of course, as for what they thought, there were many others. After all, the middle world was a much bigger stage than the small world. To many ambitious people, this was a great place to go. But to some people who only wanted to eat, it was a nightmare. As for what these people thought, Xiao Yang didn't care at all. After all, the world was big and there were all kinds of strange things. Everyone had the right to choose, and it was not his place to interfere. As for the matter of forming an alliance with the other worlds, the publicity was more or less done. Most people had some ideas in their hearts, and it was not as vague as before. In order to do a good job, Ji Fei, Muyang, Chu Taiyin, Baldi, and the others, as long as they had gone out for training or knew about other worlds, they spared no effort in spreading the news. They also didn't want to destroy something because of conflict when that day came. Naturally, the alliance would not be destroyed so easily. However, the one who would be in a difficult position would still be Xiao Yang. Xiao Yang had nothing to do, so he lay down in his backyard and drank tea, thinking about things. Sometimes, when he saw Xiao Man, he would give her some pointers on her cultivation. However, Xiao Man still didn't seem to care. All she did was pour tea and ask about his well-being. Of course, this seemed to be the only thing Xiao Man could do right now. With Xiao Yang's personal guidance, Xiao Man's cultivation could be said to have advanced by leaps and bounds. In this short period of time, there were already signs of him breaking through to the next realm. Naturally, no one else knew about this news. After all, everyone's eyes were on Xiao Gongzhu. How could they look at a little maidservant? Even though the maidservant had ascended from the middle world, her talent was naturally extraordinary, but she could not compare to Xiao Gongzhu. In fact, even Qian Guangqi could not compare to her. After a few more days, Xiao Yang yawned. In a daze, he saw a ball of spirit qi rapidly gathering. In the blink of an eye, the spirit qi gathered into a woman. The woman's skin was fair, and her expression was otherworldly. Of course, more than that, it made people feel a kind of coldness, a coldness that came from the great path. Looking at the woman in front of him, Xiao Yang could not help but frown. This was because he felt that the woman in front of him was very familiar. The answer was about to come out, but he did not dare to say it out loud. "What? Are you stunned?" The woman said with a smile. Her tone was full of emptiness. This feeling made Xiao Yang feel that it was a little unreal. However, how different was this attitude from the woman in the clouds that he had seen before? There were simply too many miraculous things to describe. "Heart of the world?" Xiao Yang asked with a stutter. This was because he felt that what he saw in front of him was a little unreal, because what he was seeing now was something he had never heard of or seen before. The woman shook her head and said, "I'm the world's spirit now. Thanks to you, I've condensed the world's spiritual meridian this time, and my spiritual body has become much more perfect." Xiao Yang was still shocked when he heard that. Although the world spirit and the heart of the world only had a one-word difference, the difference between the two could not be summed up in a few words. The birth of the world spirit did not only mean that the contracted person had reached the martial emperor realm. After all, Su Changtian had done the same in the flowing cloud realm. However, the heart of the world was still the heart of the world. If there was a difference, it would be the heavenly punishment lightning tribulation. Although the heavenly punishment lightning tribulation was more destructive, there could be no construction without destruction. The heart of the world had also benefited from the disaster and received many gifts. The heart of the world could only appear as a spiritual body, and the power that it could use was also very limited. However, the world spirit was different, although it was still bound to its own world and could not leave it at all. However, it could appear as a physical body and roam around the world. That's pretty good, Xiaoyang said with a smile. This time they had sacrificed a lot under the heavenly punishment lightning tribulation, but the benefits that they received were not bad either. At least based on the current situation, they had received many benefits from the heavenly punishment lightning tribulation. The birth of the world spiritual meridian and the improvement of the world spirit were both unexpected things. However, this was not as simple as adding flowers to a brocade. Instead, the fruits of victory were magnified countless times. Don't you want to know why Su Changtian attacked me back then? The woman smiled and asked. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed slightly at this moment. Since ancient times, people's hearts were the most unpredictable things. Chapter 21-23. Faced with such a question, Xiaoyang only smiled. The way he looked at the woman in front of him had also changed slightly. Then he turned his head and sighed. I don't need to know. I've said it before, everything has a cause and effect. Even if I steal the world's qi, I can be strong for a while, but the backlash in the future won't be so simple. Logically speaking, that's too risky. There's no need for that. If you want to devour the fortune of a world, you will naturally be able to skyrocket your strength and so on. However, it's hard to get rid of the bad luck in the future. You forcefully broke through to the martial emperor realm and did not hesitate to challenge those of a higher level. You even tried your best to fight against the god's punishment. Isn't that risky and crazy? The woman asked with a smile. The woman's smile was still very relaxed, as if she didn't mean to ask. When Xiaoyang heard these words, he once again laid down and rocked the rattan chair with a sloppy look on his face. Even after going through so much, the world spirit was still suspicious of his goal, or whether or not he could maintain his original nature. This made him feel very tired in his heart. Therefore, Xiaoyang didn't want to explain more. Of course, it was normal for the world spirit to have such thoughts. It was in charge of the development of a world. And with Su Changtian's example as an example, it naturally needed to be more appropriate in the future to avoid any mishaps. The woman looked at the sloppy and impatient appearance of the person in front of her and laughed bitterly. Lu Yun had observed this person from many angles, but the result she got in the end still made her feel very helpless. In the end, she still couldn't find an answer to whether or not he would harm her. This person had a very strict bottom line, but sometimes the things he did were also very crazy. Therefore, no one knew what kind of choices and actions he might make in the future. But at least it seemed like he was doing a good job. What Lu Yin was worried about was that after Su Changtian revealed these things, it opened up such a possibility and planted a seed in Xiaoyang's heart. It was hard to say when it would take root and sprout and eventually become a disaster. There were many things waiting to be done in the current flowing cloud world. If they were to stir up trouble again, the consequences would be unpredictable. Perhaps it was even worse than it was tens of thousands of years ago. By the way, do you have a way to make our world move? Xiaoyang asked after a long while. This was also something that Xiaoyang was very worried about. He didn't want to use the array formation given to him by the god realm. There were some things in the flowing cloud world that were best exposed as little as possible. When Lu Yun heard this, he nodded with a smile and said, As long as you help, this is a small matter. Since you've asked, it seems like the alliance agreement with the god realm has already been settled. We've already reached an agreement. It's just that the preconditions are there, Xiaoyang said with a smile. Now that he thought about it carefully, Xiaoyang still felt a little apprehensive. This was because he felt that the god emperor had dug a hole for him, a hole that was difficult to make up for. Or perhaps the god emperor wanted to be on the safe side. He was afraid that if the martial emperor died, his destiny would fall on him. That was why he made such an agreement, allowing the martial emperor to always be in his control. He used this method to ensure that his plan would proceed smoothly. What the God Emperor didn't expect was that Xiaoyang would become the 10th martial emperor, exceeding everyone's expectations. After chatting for a while, Xiaoyang went to the middle peak. After a few rounds of discussion and consideration, they were finally prepared to let go of the middle peak mystery land so that the flowing cloud world could have more land. After all, for a world to grow, it was important to have a vast territory. If there wasn't the spiritual vein of the world, the flowing cloud world would definitely not agree to this. However, this was nothing now. With the support of the spiritual vein and Xiaoyang's careful management, the middle peak might become the richest place in the flowing cloud world in the future. The name of the middle peak showed that it was the center of the flowing cloud world. If this place was managed well, it would naturally be different. Without much effort, Xiaoyang landed the middle peak, perfectly fitting it into the center of the flowing cloud boundary. When Xiaoyang saw the middle peak in its entirety, the corner of his mouth couldn't help but twitch. This was because all he could see was barren land and scars. These scars were left behind by the battle between Xiaoyang and Su Changtian. They were already beyond recognition. The alternating and irregular ravines were probably caused by the heavenly punishment, lightning tribulation. Back then, most of the 9th heavenly punishment had been transferred to the middle peak mystery land by the heart of the world to forcefully resist it. Although they had succeeded, the damage to the middle peak had become even more severe. Don't worry, manage it well. 3 years will be enough to restore life to this place. Lu Yun appeared beside Xiaoyang and said softly. Xiaoyang nodded his head. However, it wasn't an easy task to run this place. In the following period of time, Xiaoyang and the world spirit put in a lot of effort into the middle peak. They were determined to restore life to this place and turn it into the richest place in the world. The middle peak fell into Xiaoyang's hands. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that this was his private territory. However, Xiaoyang also put in a lot of effort into this place. He constantly threw in spiritual flowers and herbs to restore spiritual energy and life to this place. Even with the cooperation of the world spirit, the results were very bleak. Most of the spiritual flowers and herbs would wither and die in less than 3 days. This was like a field that had been dry for a long time. It had long cracked and lost all water. Now, there was some rain that fell occasionally, but it wasn't enough to fill the ravines. Not only was the middle peak barren, it could even be said to be incomplete. If he wanted to manage this place, he would need a lot of spiritual energy and life. Xiaoyang's current investment was like a cup of water on a burning cart of firewood. There wasn't any obvious effect. This made Xiaoyang feel helpless. However, he had a lot of good things in his hands. Therefore, he wasn't in a hurry. He could take it slow. The land was severely damaged. It would take a lot of time to make up for it completely. Unless there was a change, it would be impossible to make this place look brand new. 2 months after reaching the martial emperor level, the God Realm's special envoy, Shenwu Shuang, came to the flowing cloud realm. Chapter 21-24. After sensing unrivaled God's arrival, Xiaoyang stopped what he was doing and went out to welcome him personally. If not for unrivaled God's righteousness and the opportunity in the tomb of the God of Sin, it would have been impossible for Xiaoyang's cultivation speed to be so fast. It could also be said that it was because of unrivaled God that the Emperor God had given him so many gifts. Otherwise, based on Xiaoyang's previous cultivation speed, even King Wu's rank 9 martial emperor level would have been a little difficult for him. For a cultivator, the higher the realm, the slower the speed of cultivation. If there were no other opportunities and they cultivated step by step, it would naturally be slower than 1,000 miles in a day. Coupled with the suppression of the 3,000 minor worlds, there was nothing they could do. Therefore, Xiaoyang respected a friend like unrivaled God very much. If not for him, the prosperity of the drifting cloud realm would have been reduced by half. In the blink of an eye, Xiaoyang appeared in front of unrivaled God with a faint smile at the corner of his lips. Unrivaled God could not help being shocked when he saw Xiaoyang appearing and disappearing in front of him like a ghost. However, he soon felt relieved. After all, Xiaoyang was now a martial emperor powerhouse. It was not strange for him to have some special abilities in his own world. Initially, Unrivaled God had many thoughts in his heart. Back when they first met, Xiaoyang's level was nothing more than a mediocre person. However, now he had become the 10th most powerful person in the 3,000 minor worlds. Coupled with the fact that he had killed Han Jingming and challenged someone of a higher level, his status was enough to make him one of the best. For a long time, countless people were in awe of powerhouses. However, Unrivaled God did not feel any fear when he saw this friend of his. Instead, he was very happy, and a smile appeared on his lips. It seemed that it was not bad to be able to befriend such a friend. "Long time no see," Unrivaled God said with a faint smile. The difference in cultivation level did indeed exist. However, it was definitely not an obstacle between them. Xiaoyang nodded slightly and said, "It's only been a few years." Unrivaled God smiled as well. His friend was still the same as before. He did not change much because of the elevation of his level. Even though he was already the 10th martial emperor, he did not show any signs of arrogance or disdain. "Let's go. We'll talk as we walk," Xiaoyang said and led the way to his little courtyard. On the way there, Unrivaled God began to talk about some of the changes in the God realm. The 4 godly generals were the first to bear the brunt of it. Wei Beixin's level was because of Xiaoyang had been ruthless. Wei Beixin's friends wanted to find fault with Xiaoyang, but they were all suppressed by the God Emperor single-handedly. Even the old Prime Minister did not dare to be presumptuous. As for the last position of the 4 great godly generals, Unrivaled God had temporarily taken over this position because he had broken through to peak-level Martial King. Of course, it looked like he was giving the new generation a chance. However, it was not that simple. The God Emperor wanted to take back some power to the royal family so that it would be easier to manipulate. That was why he had God take that position. Otherwise, if it were the old Prime Minister, there might be some constraints in the future. Therefore, it was not bad to be able to gradually divide and nibble away at them. However, apart from the King of Qin, who was in charge of half of the troops, the rest of the troops were in the hands of the 4 godly generals. Now, God was in a high position and had entered the core circle of power in the God realm. As for the Sword Heart realm and the Sun Snow realm, they did not feel anything about having an ally like the Sun Snow realm. In fact, the patriarchs of both realms were very much in agreement. An ally like that was a powerful backing. It was easy to imagine what it would be like to have the 10th martial emperor. Moreover, such a person could go against the heavens. No one knew how terrifying his potential was. At the very least, after going to the middle world, they would have one more martial emperor expert. Then, the situation they would face would be better, and they would have one more helper. As for the voices of opposition in the God realm, most of them were from the old Prime Minister's faction. However, because the leaders didn't say anything, it was just a small commotion that was easily suppressed. After hearing this news, Xiaoyang had a rough idea of what was going on. It seemed that it was normal for Wei Beixin to be hated after he had crippled him and even caused him to lose some power. At least, this was within Xiaoyang's acceptable range. As for the voices of opposition, they were almost negligible. Sometimes, one strength was enough to explain too many things. If Xiaoyang had not been a martial emperor previously, this storm might have really caused a lot of trouble for the drifting cloud realm. But now, all of this didn't seem to matter anymore. After all, no matter how fierce their words were, they were just words. They were useless and could not shake the position of a martial emperor. Moreover, under such extraordinary circumstances, it was normal for there to be some extraordinary behavior and protection. After returning to the small courtyard, Xiaoyang began to pour tea and sat opposite Unrivaled God. As for Xiaomeng, Xiaoyang had taught her too much. She was now in closed-door cultivation to break through her level. Although he had become a martial emperor, Xiao Yang's attitude toward his friends did not change at all. After all, if they could become friends, how could they be considered friends if they still judged people based on their level and strength? Unrivaled God felt very comfortable now. He felt that he was lucky. He had made a lot of money in this gamble. Putting aside the fact that he had begun to force himself to break through to King Wu rank 9, Xiao Yang's attitude now was enough to comfort him. The relationship between them had already been established, and in the future it might even play a greater role. When I came here, I realized that the Drifting Cloud Realm's territory had expanded a lot. You're not only powerful, but you're even better at expanding territory, Unrivaled God said with a smile. He picked up his teacup and began to sip his tea. Xiao Yang waved his hand indifferently and said, "It's a small matter. These lands were originally the Drifting Cloud Realm's secret realm. See, I only sensed it after I became a martial emperor and removed the seal." Unrivaled God almost choked. He then smiled and gave Lin Huang a thumbs up. The current Xiaoyang had given him too many surprises. Chapter 21-25. "If I remember correctly, you're not the only one here," Xiaoyang said after some thought. The Emperor God had made it clear before that only a martial emperor powerhouse could do it. However, Unrivaled God had not reached that level yet. Therefore, he was probably only here to lead the way. She wanted to see more, so she didn't come with us. That girl's temper is indeed a little bad. Please forgive her, Unrivaled God said with a self-deprecating laugh. Xiao Yang chuckled along as well. He already knew who the visitor was. However, he was a magnanimous person. Since the other party wanted to see more, he would let him. There was no need for him to worry too much. It was just a matter of a few more days. It was nothing. "These are the Emperor God's congratulatory gifts to you," Unrivaled God said as he took out a few rings from his bosom. Xiao Yang smiled faintly and accepted them. Since they were gifts from the Emperor God, he naturally had to accept them, especially after enduring the heavenly punishment thunder tribulation. He felt that these were only natural. Unrivaled God could not help but frown slightly when he saw that this fellow was not at all courteous. Isn't this guy a little too careless with his methods? With that thought in mind, Unrivaled God had no choice but to suppress the thought. After all, the God realm owed Xiaoyang a lot. However, Xiaoyang had spent a lot of effort and almost lost his life to take down Han Jingming back then. However, the God realm had snatched away this opportunity. Speaking of which, they were somewhat in the wrong. Take these pills. Although they're not as effective as the Emperor God's pills, they'll be of great help when you condense your spiritual meridians, Xiaoyang said as he took out the meridians condensation pills he had refined and handed them to Unrivaled God. Unrivaled God put them away without hesitation after receiving them. Since he had the explosion pill before, he naturally trusted the pills that Xiaoyang had refined. At the very least, in his opinion, the other party wouldn't go so far as to harm him. As a matter of fact, I've always been curious. There are only 9 portions of the martial dominator luck in the 3,000 small worlds. So where did this 10th portion of luck come from? Unrivaled God asked very seriously. It could be said that this was the question that puzzled the entire God realm. In the divine world, there were countless existences at the pinnacle of King Wu. They had even made various attempts, but in the end, they all ended in failure. Therefore, how did Xiaoyang do it? Everyone was curious. They wanted to know, but they couldn't get an answer. This matter could be said to be a secret of the drifting cloud world. Naturally, it was not good to speak of it. However, it didn't seem appropriate to deceive a friend. I borrowed this luck from the middle world. Xiaoyang thought for a long time and came up with such a compromise. Naturally, there were some details that could not be explained. There were some things that wouldn't have much meaning if they were said out loud. Moreover, it was fine if only a few people knew the secret of the drifting cloud world. It would be bad if more people knew about it. It wasn't that Xiaoyang was deliberately fooling this old friend of his. It was just that sometimes he had no choice but to do it. Unrivaled God was stunned when he heard this answer. He thought that Xiaoyang was fooling him. However, his eyes were filled with shock right after. However, it was inevitable that such words would make people feel that he was trying to fool them. However, if one thought about it carefully, it made sense. If he hadn't borrowed luck from the middle world, Xiaoyang wouldn't have had such an opportunity. How many geniuses with martial dominator potential were there in the God realm? However, the number of people who could reach that stage could be counted with one's fingers. All of this was because of the suppression of the 3,000 small worlds. No matter how terrifyingly talented one was, it would be useless in the end. After a long while, Unrivaled God gave a thumbs up and said, "You're really amazing." As for how this method worked, Unrivaled God wasn't going to ask further. When heavenly punishment appeared back then, even the God Emperor and the others could feel its power from a few worlds away. It was obvious how terrifying it was. If others were to rashly learn this method, the final outcome would probably only be death, like drawing water with a bamboo basket. Now that he was already in the middle world, there was no reason to be anxious. Once he went to the middle world, he wouldn't lack anything. Xiaoyang had no choice but to do this, so he could only take the risk. However, they were different. They didn't have to do that. "You're really a monster. How could you do that?" Unrivaled God exclaimed. Xiaoyang nodded with a smile. Although there was a lot of heartache, it was all in the past. Meanwhile, Unrivaled God had also noticed that the formation in Borealis City had been destroyed. Clearly, the formation that his father had praised had been destroyed by the heavenly punishment. It was hard to imagine how much Xiaoyang had to pay under heavenly punishment. After chatting for a while, the two of them finished handing over the important matters and began to pick up where they left off. At the same time, Xiaoyang also revealed some of his cultivation experiences, intentionally or otherwise, in hopes of giving Unrivaled God more help. In the end, after some conversation, Unrivaled God actually sensed something. He took the pills that Xiaoyang had given him and went into closed-door cultivation right away, beginning to condense his fourth spiritual meridian. After that, Xiaoyang went to the Castellan's residence and told the two heroes of the Sun clan about these matters so that they would have a better idea of what to do. Of course, everything that should be arranged was arranged without the slightest bit of error. Everything was arranged. Many people began to act quickly. After hearing that the Heavenly Realm's special envoy had arrived, many people were extremely excited. The middle world of the drifting cloud realm seemed to be right in front of them. This could be said to be incomparably exciting news. Many sects also began to respond to Lord Zhao's order, ordering all their disciples to cultivate in their own worlds and not to go out to train. If there was anything that they needed help with, they were not stingy. All the capable disciples went to Baixing City and listened to Sun Yukai and Sun Dishing's orders. Of course, the main forces were the Taiyin sect, the Taiyang sect, and the Dark Knight Holy Land. These three forces were the strongest. Chapter 21-26. When everyone was united, no matter what they did, it was relatively easy. In fact, it could be said to be extremely simple. The entire drifting cloud boundary, under the orders of a few people, began to operate in an orderly manner. Everything seemed to be very normal and normal. It was as if what they were doing wasn't some great undertaking, but something that couldn't be any more normal. 3 days later, Sun Yukai and Sun Dishing came to Xiaoyang's courtyard and began to report their work in the past few days. Everything was in an orderly manner. In fact, there were many things that exceeded their expectations. After reporting everything, Sun Dishing and Sun Yukai looked at each other. It was as if they had something they couldn't say and were too embarrassed to speak. It was rare for Xiaoyang to see the two of them in such a hesitant manner. Therefore, he was more or less curious about what they were thinking. Xiaoyang didn't say anything. They didn't say anything either. They were extremely conflicted and stood there helplessly. "What is it? Just say it." Xiaoyang saw that they didn't speak for a long time, so he could only ask first. Sun Dishing was conflicted for a long time. Then he took a deep breath and suppressed his thoughts. "City Lord, You are now the lord of the drifting cloud boundary. Also, the drifting cloud boundary is about to form an alliance with the god realm and head to the middle world. Therefore, from how we see it, it's equivalent to the beginning of a new era and a new era. What do you think? When they said this, they were very careful. However, before this, the drifting cloud boundary didn't have an era to speak of. At that time, it was only under the illumination of the resplendent cultivators that some of the relevant records were recorded. For example, recently Muyang, Chu Taiyin, and Xiao Changshan at their peak were called the era. However, now this didn't seem to be appropriate. That's feasible. Xiaoyang said, with an era as a timeline, some things were easier to record. It could be said that the ancient books of the drifting cloud boundary were often difficult to verify because there was no era. It made people feel helpless. We are preparing to use the new era. What do you think? Sun Yukai asked. Xiaoyang thought for a moment, then nodded and said, It's possible. After a few more words, Sun Dishing and Sun Yukai left and began to announce the new era. Changing the era might seem insignificant, but it also showed the ambition of the Sun family's two heroes. What they wanted was definitely not such a simple achievement. Their ambitions were great, and their expectations for the future of the flowing cloud realm were also not small. Handing the future of the flowing cloud domain to such a person seemed to be a good choice. Of course, it was also because of their own realms that they were treading on thin ice even though they held high positions, so they wouldn't make any wrong decisions. As long as it wasn't too overboard, Xiaoyang could tolerate it. Having ambition was naturally a good thing. Another day passed, and Sun Yukai and Sun Dishing announced that the flowing cloud world had officially entered the epic era. As for Xiaoyang, he was still oblivious to the outside world and stayed in his small courtyard. Suddenly, a sharp sword flew over. After drawing a circle in the sky, it landed on Xiaoyang's hand. Looking at the red and white colors on the sword, Xiaoyang couldn't help but take a deep breath. The corners of his mouth also curled up slightly, and he was very satisfied. I didn't expect it to succeed, Xiaoyang said with a smile. In his hand was the Thunder Fire Divine Sword. After receiving the heavenly punishment Lightning Tribulation, this divine sword was already on the verge of collapse. However, it was taken away by Lu Yin in the end and placed into the earth core fire to be refined. If it succeeded, then the Thunder Fire Divine Sword would be upgraded. If it failed, then this Upper Sage level magic weapon would be completely useless. Now, it seemed that such a color had appeared, so it was naturally a success. Moreover, Xiaoyang could also feel that in the magic weapon, there was indeed a trace of spiritual energy. The magic weapon above the sage level was a divine weapon. Of course, this was just a saying in the 3,000 small worlds. Speaking of which, the current Thunder Fire Divine Sword was not at the sage level, but a spiritual weapon. The simplest sign of a spirit-grade magic tool was whether or not it was able to develop spiritual intelligence. Once it had spiritual intelligence, whether it was a cultivator, a magic weapon, or a ferocious beast, there would be earth-shattering changes. It could be said that at this level the path of cultivation had truly begun. Previously, it was only the most basic thing. Of course, this was only in Xiaoyang's eyes in the past. However, in the 3,000 small worlds, the end was only the beginning of that world. The worlds were different, so there was nothing to compare. How's the matter I told you about? Xiaoyang asked. It's very simple. As long as you put in some effort, you can move it. If I don't want to be discovered, then I can only hide in the earth's core. Lu Yin didn't show his face. Instead, he used the heart lake ripple to tell the other party his thoughts. When Xiaoyang heard this, he nodded slightly, indicating that he understood. It could be said that the flowing cloud world's greatest secret was the world spirit. Therefore, no matter what, he had to hide it well so as to avoid causing unnecessary trouble for himself when the time came. Otherwise, when the time came, it wouldn't be wonderful. Everything is ready. As for the specifics, I'll tell you later. Lu Yun said. When Xiaoyang heard this, he nodded slightly. Now, he still had some concerns in his heart. Some secrets were fine if they weren't discovered. However, once they were, some people with ulterior motives would inevitably do some crazy things. Xiao Yang was very clear about this point. One had to be vigilant against others. Even if it was their ally, the God realm, they had to be vigilant. I can also live in your body. However, if I do that, once you leave the flowing cloud world, I will be exposed. Lu Yun said. Xiao Yang shrugged helplessly and said, be careful. When the time comes, it's inevitable that I will go to the God realm. Understood, Lu Yun replied. Then, Lu Yun returned to the earth's core. Xiao Yang rubbed his brows, looking very worried. Regarding the protection of the heart of the realm, Xiao Yang was truly helpless right now. How could he ensure that everything was safe? However, just as he was feeling conflicted, he suddenly sensed a strong aura. In the blink of an eye, Xiao Yang disappeared from the small courtyard and rushed towards the strong aura. Chapter 21-27. A woman dressed in white, like a fairy, landed on the middle peak. She looked up and saw some withered flowers and plants. Although they were all spiritual flowers and herbs, there was no trace of spiritual energy to speak of. All this time, it was the soil that nurtured these flowers and plants. However, the situation was completely reversed now. It was not difficult to know the reason for this. This was because the soil did not have any spiritual energy to speak of. Now, it could only absorb the spiritual energy of these flowers and plants to nourish itself and make the soil fertile. However, this kind of efficiency was a little too slow. It was even a little bit of a waste of natural resources. After the fairy-like woman arrived in the drifting cloud realm, she concealed her aura and walked around this world. She wanted to know more about this world and that person. In these few days of visiting, she had indeed obtained a lot of information. That person could be said to be a godlike existence in his own world. It was as if he was omnipotent and awe-inspiring. She walked past the snow-covered North Peak grotto heaven with many ferocious beasts. She also went to the southernmost far southern grotto heaven and sensed the hidden murderous intent. These were all created by that person with his own strength. It could be said that he was the only person in the drifting cloud realm. Soon, the woman saw that man appear in front of her. Princess Mingzhu, long time no see. Xiao Yang smiled and greeted her. The woman was Princess Mingzhu. She was also the one who was ordered to help Xiao Yang push the drifting cloud realm to the God realm. Originally, she came with unrivaled God. However, she was full of doubts and wanted to see more of this place. Therefore, she concealed her aura and visited incognito. Now that she had seen what she wanted to see, she revealed her aura and lured Xiao Yang over. Princess Mingzhu nodded with a smile and said, "You are indeed surprising." Xiao Yang was a little confused by her words. He did not even understand what she meant. However, it was good to take it as a compliment. Sometimes it was meaningless to think too much about it. Furthermore, he did not have much contact with this Princess Mingzhu, so he did not know her temperament. Sometimes, thinking too much was nothing more than worrying oneself for nothing. If I'm not wrong, this place was probably struck by the heavenly punishment lightning tribulation, Princess Mingzhu said quietly. Xiao Yang did not refute. Since the other party had seen through it, there was nothing to deny. Moreover, there were some things that could not be covered up with words. You're using these incomparably precious spiritual flowers and spiritual grasses to nourish this land. Isn't the price you're paying a little too high? Princess Mingzhu asked. This was the biggest doubt in Princess Mingzhu's heart. At the very least, in his opinion, this method was indeed somewhat inappropriate. Furthermore, the price they had to pay was not small either. Countless precious flowers and plants could only wither in the end and feed back to the land. Xiao Yang shook his head indifferently and said, "The price is a little too high, but it can restore life to this land. This is a plan that takes 10,000 years. What's a momentary loss?" Hearing that, Princess Mingzhu was stunned for a moment, then she nodded with a smile. It seemed that Xiaoyang was indeed looking at the long term, which was why he had such thoughts. From this point, it could be seen that this young man truly loved his world very much. Therefore, when the God realm threw out such tempting conditions back then, he did not betray his world and join the God realm to obtain such benefits. Instead, he went through untold hardships to reach the alliance agreement so that it could be effective and they could both advance together. Your plan is indeed not bad. However, right now, the flowing cloud world is lacking resources the most. You did not do this, and in the current situation, it's a little willful, Princess Mingzhu said. Xiaoyang smiled and did not say anything. How could some of the mysteries within be explained in a few words? Of course, what Princess Mingzhu said was true. However, the earlier the central peak was restored, the more benefits the drifting cloud realm would receive. As for the resources that were sacrificed, they were not part of the plan. Although resources were precious, they needed to be distributed in moderation to achieve the best results. Although Xiaoyang was skilled in the art of alchemy, the pills that he refined were mostly just icing on the cake. He did not want all the cultivators in the flowing cloud world to be nurtured by medicinal power. Of course, what surprised me the most was that this world actually gave birth to a world spirit vein, Princess Mingzhu said with a sigh. At the same time, she looked at Xiaoyang. It could be said that this was what she admired the most. In the 3,000 small worlds, only the God realm had a world spirit vein. But now, there was an additional flowing cloud world. Although the world spirit vein in the flowing cloud world was still very weak and it would take a very long time for it to grow. However, with it was different. Instantly, Xiaoyang's expression changed. This was because he did not expect the world spirit vein to be discovered. No matter what, this was not good news for the flowing cloud world. After all, the preciousness of the world spirit vein was self-evident. Moreover, martial emperors also had the ability to uproot the world's spiritual veins. Don't worry, the God realm would not do such a shameless thing to steal the resources of their allies, Princess Mingzhu said as if she saw through his worries. Hearing this, Xiaoyang's expression did not soften. Instead, he smiled and his expression was still serious. Xiaoyang started to plan quickly in his heart about how to make up for this mistake in the future. After all, there were some things that the fewer people who knew, the better. Fortunately, Princess Mingzhu did not seem to have discovered the existence of the world spirit. This made Xiaoyang feel more at ease. If this secret was discovered by others, then there would be endless troubles in the future. Suddenly, Xiaoyang thought of another possibility. In order to hide its existence, the world spirit purposely leaked the aura of the world spirit to confuse others so that it would not be easy to discover it. I did not mean that. I was just lamenting that the times have changed too quickly, Xiaoyang said as he laughed awkwardly. Chapter 21-28. Princess Mingzhu looked at the man in front of her. He didn't seem to have changed because of the breakthrough. Now he still had that unruly look. It was as though no matter what kind of change was in front of him, even if it was a stormy sea, he could face it calmly. Or perhaps he had already thought of a plan to deal with it when he turned around. He knew how to deal with the matter in the most appropriate way. Of course, Princess Mingzhu could still figure out what Xiaoyang was thinking and what kind of calculations he had. But now, she didn't dare to be so sure, because for such a person, one would never be able to see through his thoughts and what he was thinking about with alcohol. And such people were usually more difficult to figure out. Similarly, such people were also the most difficult to control. They had their own thoughts and goals. No matter what kind of changes were made, it could be said that no matter how many changes were made, it would still be the same. Now that she thought about it, it was a wise choice not to force him to join the realm of the gods back then, but to leave a huge place for him to return to. In the past, Princess Mingzhu couldn't understand. Although this young man had many outstanding aspects, he was only a person with top-notch talent. In the realm of the gods, there were still a lot of people like him. Although he had outstanding aspects, it was still possible to find someone who could compare with him. But today, Xiaoyang went against the heavens and became the 10th martial emperor in the 3,000 small worlds. He broke the rule that had been in place since ancient times. He even withstood the heavenly punishment and came to where he was now. These were enough to explain too many problems. He was really different. Xiaoyang still had a faint smile on his face. He was still a little afraid of this princess of the realm of the gods. After all, at the Jade Pool banquet, because of her standing in front of him, who knew how much trouble she had brought to him. Of course, those troubles were also solved. However, sometimes less trouble was the best outcome. At least at this moment, Xiaoyang still wanted less trouble. If you really think that way, I'm afraid it's not you. Let's talk about something more realistic. Our divine realm possesses 2 world spiritual veins. Is there a need for us to covet your spiritual vein that has yet to take form? Princess Mingzhu still had an appearance of disdain. Xiaoyang also smiled and nodded. That was indeed the case. Of course, he trusted the God Emperor even more. In order to upgrade his world to a medium world, the Divine Emperor could be said to have racked his brains. It was also because of this that the God Emperor had his own breadth of mind and vision. At the very least, the fact that he dared to invest like that before was enough to show that he was really an emperor of a generation, the kind that stood out from the rest. Even though he had not been involved in worldly affairs for many years, and had even delegated most of his power to the 3 princes, for generals and the prime minister, his ambition had always been there. That makes sense, Xiaoyang said with a faint smile. Xiaoyang was still a little confused about what Princess Mingzhu was trying to say. In the face of such an extraordinary woman, he felt somewhat helpless in his heart. Of course, speaking of which, the state of mind of such a person was the most difficult to fathom. Of course, Xiaoyang did not have that kind of mood. At least, from his point of view, it seemed that there was not much of a need to guess. After all, when the water came, the earth would cover it with water. Now that they were already allies, sometimes there was no need to be so calculative. There were some things that just needed to be covered up. Actually, I have always been very curious about how you managed to survive the heavenly punishment lightning test, Princess Mingzhu asked. After Princess Mingzhu had investigated this question in the drifting cloud world and found out that there were a total of 9 heavenly punishment lightning tests, she was extremely shocked. Although she already had a lot of answers in her heart after hearing and visiting countless people, she still had a lot of answers. Now that she thought about it, she still felt that it was a little unbelievable. However, one should know that the power of the heavenly punishment lightning test had shaken everything within 1,000 miles radius. As a nature-defying person who was targeted, the power of every attack was probably above the full power of a martial emperor. In fact, under such gradual accumulation, the power of the attack was so great that if it was spread out, it was possible to destroy a small world. However, this young man had turned the danger into safety. Moreover, he had grasped such luck and turned the danger into safety, completing a magnificent feat that no one had ever done before. It seems that all of you want to know the answer. Then I will tell you. I only survived by using the power of the entire drifting cloud world. This was a huge gamble, and obviously I made the right bet. As Xiaoyang spoke, the corners of his mouth curled up into a smile. Thinking about all the things that had happened in the past, even now, Xiaoyang still had some lingering fear in his heart. All of his life force had been used up by the heavenly punishment lightning test. If he had not broken through to the martial emperor realm, even if he had survived, he would not have lived for long. The more he gained, the corresponding price he had to pay was not small. What was supposed to be an incomparably magnificent and shocking event was now described by this young man in a casual tone. It was as if his bravery back then was not worth mentioning. During the change in the tomb of the god of sin, he was able to find clues and turn the situation around in the blink of an eye without informing anyone. He even made the final decision and saved everyone. Until now, he was still the same. He had done something that no one expected. However, Princess Mingzhu was still a little unconvinced. She was known as the #1 genius in the 3,000 small worlds. But now, compared to this person in front of him, what was he worth? She had only reached this step by relying on luck. Compared to him, was she really considered to be talented? Suddenly, Princess Mingzhu laughed bitterly and helplessly. It was as if the magnificent feat she had accomplished back then had become a joke. At the same time, it made her feel very uncomfortable. This was not a good outcome. At this moment, Xiaoyang also felt that the atmosphere had undergone a huge change. He even felt a little scared, as if something was going to happen. It was very uncomfortable. In the blink of an eye, Princess Mingzhu waved her hand in the void, and a sword appeared in her hand. The tip of the sword was pointed at Xiaoyang. The battle intent in it was even more brilliant, and she did not restrain it at all. Chapter 21-29. It was a terrible feeling to be pointed at by a sword. Moreover, Xiaoyang also felt as if there was a blade on his back. It was very uncomfortable. At this moment, Princess Mingzhu's gaze was incomparably resolute. The battle intent emitted from her body could be said to be surging. "Which part are you going to sing?" Xiaoyang laughed bitterly. He was really helpless right now. "I'll fight you," Princess Mingzhu answered with determination. Ever since she found out that Han Jingming had died at Xiaoyang's hands, that portion of fate had been freed up, Princess Mingzhu had been extremely shocked. She felt that this was completely impossible. However, she had to admit that it was the truth. Later on, Xiaoyang defied the heavens and withstood the heavenly punishment lightning to become the 10th martial emperor in the 3,000 small worlds. At that moment, Princess Mingzhu felt that her brilliance had dimmed. Compared to such a guy, it seemed that he was still somewhat lacking. So what could he say? But now, Princess Mingzhu's competitive heart had also grown. It seemed that only after this battle could the outcome be determined. Who was the stronger one among the younger generation in the 3,000 small worlds would be the deciding factor. Princess Mingzhu, who had always been at the top, was naturally unwilling to admit defeat. How could she turn a blind eye when she felt that her status was being challenged? Of course, there was another reason, and that was that Xiaoyang was indeed very strong. She wanted to see who would be the stronger one in the battle between the two of them. The showdown between experts had always been something that people looked forward to. Princess Mingzhu had been invincible among her peers all the way up. It was very lonely, now that someone who was on par with her had appeared. How could she miss such a great opportunity? At least, to her, the battle was unavoidable. Xiaoyang's mouth twitched when he heard that. Originally, he wanted to refuse. However, after sensing the other party's strong fighting spirit, it was impossible for him to give up just like that. "There's no need for that," Xiaoyang said helplessly. Princess Mingzhu shook her head and said, "It's necessary." Princess Mingzhu was extremely eager for this battle. She wanted to complete this battle and defeat her opponent. She wanted to let everyone in the world know that she was still in existence at the pinnacle and that no one could shake her. Even if Xiaoyang was strong enough to go against the Tao, even if he was strong enough, he still could not shake his position. After receiving such a firm answer, Xiaoyang sighed helplessly. From the looks of it, this battle was unavoidable. Even if he did not make a move, Princess Mingzhu would not let the matter rest. Who knows, they might even use different methods to force him. If that was the case, he might as well agree to it earlier and settle this matter before talking about anything else. "Stop before it's too late?" Xiaoyang asked seriously. Princess Mingzhu thought for a moment and then nodded. They still had a heavy burden on their shoulders. If they didn't stop until they were dead, even if they were seriously injured in the end, it would still be difficult for them to make a mistake. Therefore, in this situation, it seemed to be the best choice to stop at a certain point. "All right," Princess Mingzhu replied. After receiving her reply, Xiaoyang soared into the sky and headed out of the drifting cloud world. In the drifting cloud world, Xiaoyang could use the world's power as much as he wanted. This was more or less unfair to Princess Mingzhu. Moreover, the attack of a martial emperor was no small matter. It might even cause damage to his world. Therefore, it was naturally the best choice to go out and fight. Princess Mingzhu followed, closely behind. Even though she was in a hurry, she still looked like an otherworldly fairy. She did not disturb him at all. As they gradually left the drifting cloud world, Princess Mingzhu began to have some thoughts. Xiaoyang led the way in front. Now, his mood had become much heavier. In this battle that was inevitable, he felt quite helpless. However, his opponent's obsession was just too strong. This battle could not be avoided. He could only fight forcefully. After this battle, it was hard to predict what kind of changes would occur. At the very least, from Xiaoyang's point of view, he had to be more careful so that he would not end up hurting her. Xiaoyang had seen quite a few peak geniuses, like Princess Mingzhu. Sometimes, when the wind was against them, they could not help but feel doubtful. Some could break through their mental barriers and reach a higher level. However, most people were unable to accept reality. In the end, they became discouraged and wasted their lives. As such, how to fight this battle and how to fight it beautifully seemed to have become the thing that Xiaoyang was most worried about. However, Princess Mingzhu's thoughts were much simpler. She only thought about how to obtain victory. As for the other relationships, she did not have to worry about them at all. In her eyes, everything was so simple and clear. In Borealis City, a majestic wave of spiritual qi poured down. Immediately, many people were shocked. Soon, Sun Dishing and Sun Yukai suppressed the matter. After all, there were many experts in the drifting cloud realm now. It was not strange for such a situation to occur. Many people did not pay much attention to it. However, the two heroes of the Sun clan knew very well that this was not a simple matter. After all, they were well aware of who the powerhouses in the drifting cloud realm were and what the current situation was. However, it was not their style for such a situation to occur. At Sun Dishing's behest, Chen Mingho and Baldy went to check it out right away. Only when they saw unrivaled God show up did they finally relax. Both of you, it seems like you've had a good harvest these days. You've broken through your level again, Shen Wushuang teased. Baldy did not treat the sloppy Shen Wushuang as an outsider. He said, "You're not bad yourself. You've even condensed for spiritual meridians now. You're beyond our reach." Shen Wushuang only smiled. Then he lifted his head and looked up into the sky. Baldy and Chen Mingho found it strange. They looked up at the same time. However, they saw nothing. There was a huge sun in the sky, surrounded by floating clouds. This seemed to be the only scenery they could see. "What are you looking at?" Baldy was really curious. He asked, hoping to get an answer. Shen Wushuang yawned and said, "Nothing. There's a man and a woman fighting in the sky. Take a closer look." Chapter 2130. Baldy and Chen Mingho thought his tone was a little strange. They glanced at him and realized that he was still acting as if he had seen something extraordinary. This made them even more curious. What was going on? Or was it because he had better eyesight that he could see everything clearly? "Are you sure you're not trying to trick us?" Baldy asked doubtfully after watching for a while. After all, the two of them really didn't see anything. Apart from the blue sky, white clouds, and the sun, there was nothing else. Occasionally, birds would fly by. Unrivaled God glanced at the two of them in disdain, saying, "Do you think I'm the kind of person who would trick you? You think I'm lying to you because your eyesight is bad? If you want to see it clearly, walk out of the drifting cloud realm. You'll see it clearly, but let me remind you that you'll have to bear the consequences." Baldy and Chen Mingho were even more confused after hearing this. However, they waved their hands when they saw unrivaled God's joking and serious expression. They felt that it was better for them not to get involved in such a mysterious matter. After all, even unrivaled God was hiding in this small courtyard to observe. It was clear that the two of them were not to be trifled with. The drifting cloud realm was on the verge of death now. It was better not to get involved in some trouble. Looks like a battle between the two of you is unavoidable, Unrivaled God thought to himself and sighed helplessly. Unrivaled God had some understanding of Princess Mingju's character. Naturally, he knew that she would not do her best in the drifting cloud realm this time. If she wanted to prove herself, this battle was inevitable. Right now, Unrivaled God could only hope that Xiaoyang would be more magnanimous like a man. It was better not to get serious with a girl. If it was just a spar, Unrivaled God felt that his sister had a much better chance of winning. If they were serious, with Xiaoyang's combat experience, he could completely destroy Princess Mingju. Both of them had their own advantages. It would depend on how the battle went. Xiaoyang only stopped when he felt that the safe distance had been ensured after he was 3,000 miles away from the drifting cloud realm. Princess Mingju, on the other hand, stopped when she was a mile away from her opponent, glaring at him like a tiger watching its prey. The atmosphere changed drastically as the two of them stared at each other. At this moment, the battle intent of the two sides could be said to be at each other's throats, neither giving way to the other. They all knew that the strength of their opponent was immeasurable. Ever since they had reached the martial emperor realm, they had never met, let alone fought. Hence, they knew very little about each other. Their understanding of each other was only limited to their reputations. However, his true strength was still an unknown. In the next moment, Xiaoyang waved his hand and the Thunderfire Divine sword appeared in his hand. Amazing! Princess Mingju couldn't help but sigh from the bottom of her heart. This Fire Divine sword was the prize of the previous great competition of the God Realm. At that time, it was merely a middle-grade Saint Grade sword. However, in Xiaoyang's hands, it had already entered the ranks of spiritual weapons. How could she not be shocked? It turned out that not only was he extraordinarily talented in alchemy and battle, but he also seemed to have extraordinary attainments in weapon refinement. Xiaoyang smiled faintly and said, "I'm just a little lucky." Although Xiaoyang had indeed obtained the secret of refining and nurturing weapons in the God Realm, he didn't spend much effort on the Thunderfire Divine Sword. Most of the time, it was the spirit of the world that helped him to refine it. Princess Mingju smiled faintly. Being lucky was indeed one of the reasons. However, if you didn't do anything and didn't work hard, no matter how lucky you were, you wouldn't be able to catch it. It would only slip away from your hands. You're so humble. It makes others think that you're mocking me, Princess Mingju said unhappily. Xiaoyang was really helpless against a woman who was full of mouths. Sometimes, making excuses was hypocritical. If you were to speak the truth, others would think that you were arrogant. Hence, speaking was an art. However, if you want to say it to the point where it's just right, that's even more difficult. At least, in Xiaoyang's opinion, it was several times more difficult than cultivation. However, there was no other way. Since things had come to this, he could only accept it calmly. It was meaningless to think too much. If that's what you think, then so be it, Xiaoyang said helplessly. Xiaoyang felt that it was best to avoid provoking this person in front of him. After all, the more he said, the more mistakes he might make. Since they were going to fight, then they should fight to their heart's content. After it was over, they would do whatever they had to do. This was because, from the beginning, Unrivaled God's momentum had made Xiaoyang understand that he had to deliberately keep his distance. Otherwise, he would inevitably cause some trouble. Princess Mingju only frowned slightly at such shameless words. Xiaoyang's nature seemed to have always been like this. He did not care about things at all. Most of the time, he did things according to his own temper. Then, Princess Mingju waved the sword in her hand. Immediately, streaks of sword energy flowed out. It looked extremely gentle and beautiful. The sword energy seemed harmless, as beautiful as the petals of a fairy scattering flowers. However, in reality, each streak of sword energy was enough to severely injure a peak-level King Wu. a martial emperor powerhouse was that terrifying. Sometimes, just the aura that was inadvertently revealed was enough to shock and frighten people. After sensing the change, Xiaoyang held the divine sword horizontally. Instantly, he entered a state of full concentration. Although Xiaoyang was very confident in his own abilities, Princess Mingzhu was not an ordinary person. However, Princess Mingzhu wasn't an ordinary person either. She was a genius among geniuses and couldn't be underestimated. The battle between the two of them could be said to be a battle between the top two geniuses of the 3,000 small worlds. In the next moment, Princess Mingzhu stabbed with her sword. It was very clean, without the slightest hesitation or stagnation. Everything was as smooth as flowing water. It was incomparably smooth. Seeing it made one feel incomparably carefree. It was also as if the sword was a part of nature. She was the Great Tao. Her attack was an attack that matched the Great Tao. It was impeccable. Looking at Princess Mingzhu, who had become one with her surroundings, Xiaoyang felt a lot of pressure in his heart. Those who were blessed by the heavens were indeed different. Chapter 2131. Xiaoyang's heart was filled with shock when he saw such a natural sword coming towards him. It was as if there was no way to dodge it. The might of this sword strike was a bit too overbearing, causing everyone to be flabbergasted and find it hard to believe. This was why Princess Mingzhu was so powerful. No matter what she did, she had her own unique talent. That was also the reason why his strength was so extraordinary and unshakable. Even when she made a move, it contained the true meaning of the 3,000 small worlds. This was especially true after he had advanced to the martial emperor realm. This characteristic could be said to be vividly displayed. This was why she was so terrifying. It was enough to make countless people look up to her, but find it hard to reach her. However, she was the only one who was favored by the god of light. To be able to get to where she was today was extremely smooth. This was even more shocking. This was why fate was so terrifying. Without any difficulties, she was able to achieve what she did. This was something others were jealous of. Plus, Princess Mingzhu was a hardworking cultivator. She worked even harder than other geniuses. Because of this, her capabilities were enough to look down on the younger generation. In other words, if it weren't for Xiaoyang, she would be the one and only existence in the 3,000 small worlds. In other words, she would be the youngest martial emperor realm powerhouse. However, all of this changed because of Xiaoyang's appearance. It was also because of this that she was somewhat unconvinced and attacked in anger. She wanted to prove that her position was still an unshakable existence. Of course, they were both good whetstones. If they were used well, there would be unexpected results. On this point, she could see it clearly. This was why she was so insistent on this battle. As for the result, it didn't seem that important anymore. The most important thing was that this battle would benefit both of them. If they couldn't get back up because of their mentality, then it was their own problem. They couldn't blame anyone else. Xiaoyang's gaze was also fixed on the tip of the sword, and his expression instantly became a lot more serious. At this moment, he felt a great amount of pressure. It was as if the other party was a heavenly tribulation, causing him to be extremely fearful. Since Xiaoyang was someone who defied the heavens and went against the fate of the 3,000 small worlds, then Princess Mingzhu, who was favored by the heavens, was like the spokesperson of the 3,000 small worlds. Under such circumstances, the opposition between them seemed to be even more obvious. The gap between the two of them didn't seem too big, but they represented different standpoints. So what if they were allies? When they attacked, they had already sunk into their own wills and were fighting for their own great Daos. It was also because of this that when Princess Mingzhu drew her sword, she felt that she was blessed with good fortune. It was as if everything was as it should be. Such a tricky angle made him feel very strange. How did he do it? Princess Mingzhu did not have an answer in her heart. She also could not figure out what was going on. However, this feeling was very strange. Xiao Yang coldly snorted, and with a thought, he had already clearly seen the profoundness of the sword. He placed the sword horizontally in front of his chest. Clang! The crisp sound of metal clashing could be heard. It was as if the sword was unavoidable, but it was easily blocked by Xiao Yang. Suddenly, a huge force attacked him. Xiao Yang could not control himself. He retreated a few feet before he could stabilize himself. Princess Mingzhu saw this and could not help but frown slightly. She felt that it was a little unbelievable. However, she quickly swept these thoughts away. This was because she knew very well that she was facing an outstanding person among the younger generation. When King Wu was at his peak, he had completed the magnificent feat of killing a martial emperor. How could he be an ordinary person? Therefore, it was reasonable for him to be able to block this exquisite sword attack. However, it was hard for her not to be shocked. Princess Mingzhu would not have found it strange if the other party had broken through with brute force. However, the other party seemed to have casually blocked all the killing intent of the sword. This was the terrifying part. At this moment, Princess Mingzhu's heart was filled with many doubts. However, these were not beneficial to the progress of the battle. Therefore, she completely threw them to the back of her mind and immediately attacked with the second sword. The second sword seemed to be even more ordinary than the previous one. However, in Xiao Yang's eyes, he could tell that this sword was even more terrifying than the previous one. This was because, although it seemed ordinary, it was more compatible with the Great Way. This really made people feel somewhat helpless. At this stage, Xiao Yang made up his mind. He held the divine sword in his hand upside down and formed a sword with his other hand. Princess Mingzhu was clearly in a good state with the support of the fate of the 3,000 worlds. If this was allowed to happen, it might become the second heavenly punishment in the end. After sensing such an unforeseen event, Xiao Yang already had an idea in his heart. He had to stop this from happening. Otherwise, he wouldn't have a good ending. Suddenly, countless sword qi condensed around Xiao Yang at this moment. When Princess Mingzhu saw the sudden change in Xiao Yang's strategy, she immediately had a different opinion of him. Xiao Yang was not an impatient person. Otherwise, he would have been unable to sit still when faced with the Greenly World's conspiracy in the tomb of the god of sin. Naturally, there would not have been a reversal of the situation later. However, his current actions were more or less like a cornered dog jumping over a wall. What exactly was the reason for such a change in him? Princess Mingzhu could not understand, but she knew that once Xiao Yang panicked, she would have some advantage. In fact, it was highly possible that this battle would end sooner. Princess Mingzhu could not help but feel excited at the thought of this. If she could end this battle in a simpler way, why not? At least, to her, this was a great opportunity. However, Princess Mingzhu didn't need to figure out what exactly happened. Sometimes, being lucky was also a part of one's strength. Moreover, she was the heavenly chosen child. No matter what happened, it was reasonable. This was also one of Princess Mingzhu's greatest confidence. The heavenly way was on her side, so she could do whatever she wanted without any scruples and stand at the top. Chapter 2132. The world was ever-changing, and no one knew what would happen next. The winds and clouds were ever-changing, and fortune was unpredictable. Move like thunder. Xiao Yang exclaimed in a low voice. He immediately slashed out with his sword, and his entire body was instantly covered with lightning sword qi, which lingered around him. The murderous aura was not concealed at all. Wherever it passed, it only left behind a streak of lightning. The speed was so fast that it seemed a little slow to describe it as move like thunder. After Xiao Yang stepped into the martial emperor realm, his strength also ushered in a qualitative change. Although they were still using the same martial skill, the power displayed could only be described as the difference between heaven and earth. If his control of power was more exquisite, he might even be able to play with some simple martial skills. Those who did not know would think that it was an extremely profound martial skill. Of course, Xiaoyang did not pursue that. Moreover, his opponent was Princess Mingzhu, which made him even less inclined to do so. As long as he could defeat her, it would be a blessing. In an instant, Princess Mingzhu also felt the terrifying power of the sword, and her heart was filled with shock. The power of the Thunderfire Divine Sword was so terrifying. In addition, the Divine Sword had been upgraded from the Middle Sage grade to the Spiritual grade, which was also a qualitative change. With the upgrade of the two, even if the martial skill did not change, its power had increased by an unknown amount. It had reached a terrifying stage. At the same time, Princess Mingzhu also felt the terrifying aura contained in the martial skill. She did not dare to be careless at all. With a low shout, the sword in her hand immediately turned around and drew out a flower. Suddenly, a sword flower appeared abruptly. The beautiful sword flower was like a tall wall in an instant, which was difficult to surmount. In the blink of an eye, the two sword chis had already begun to clash, and the sound of clanging was endless. The lightning sword chi seemed to have lost all of its power under the sword flower, and it was constantly diminishing. In a short while, it disappeared without a trace. Everything looked as if it was a breeze in clouds, and it was very pleasant. However, Xiaoyang's heart was already in a perilous situation. He had never seen such a technique before. If that was the case, even if this battle continued, there would be no meaning to it. After all, the other party's advantage was simply too great. Moreover, this was the kind that was hard to make up for. Before Xiaoyang could finish his thoughts, the sword flower had already arrived in front of him. Immediately, the divine sword was swung continuously, and the crimson and white sword chi crisscrossed, breaking the sword flower. Princess Mingzhu couldn't help but frown when she saw this strange scene. This was because she felt that something was amiss. It was a very strange feeling. According to common sense, with the talent and ability that Xiaoyang had displayed before, even if he was a cripple now, his strength shouldn't have dropped so much. You still haven't recovered from your injuries from the heavenly punishment, lightning tribulation. Princess Mingzhu took a deep breath and asked in disbelief. At the very least, judging from the previous display, Xiaoyang's strength was simply too weak. Originally, he was an average existence, but now the strength that he displayed was barely a third. She found it hard to believe such a drastic change. Xiaoyang shook his head with a smile. With the nourishment of the spirit of the world and the fact that he had broken through to the martial emperor realm, his injuries had long recovered. The reason why he couldn't display his strength was very simple. It was because he was being suppressed by the 3,000 small worlds. The strength that he could display was merely King Wu's ultimate strength. If he exceeded that limit, he would probably attract the heavenly punishment again. Of course, the latter part was merely Xiaoyang's speculation. However, the suppression that he felt before was very clear. Even though Xiaoyang had become the 10th martial emperor, it was difficult for him to display his full strength. Therefore, this made him feel extremely aggrieved and uncomfortable. Then why is that? I don't believe that's all you've got, Princess Mingzhu scoffed and asked. This was what Princess Mingzhu wanted to know the most. She didn't think that Xiaoyang would hold back because of her identity. Seeing that she still didn't know anything, Xiaoyang could only chuckle bitterly. How could such a heaven-blessed person understand the pain of going against the heavens? Since he was being suppressed, he naturally wouldn't display his strength by force. After all, they weren't mortal enemies and wouldn't rest until one of them was dead. I can't help it. My luck is pretty bad, Xiaoyang said helplessly. This was also the only explanation he could give. In this aspect, he felt that he had been clearly arranged. As a result, Princess Mingzhu felt very aggrieved. Could it be that he was looking down on her, so he had been suppressing his strength? Then what do you mean? Princess Mingzhu said angrily. At that moment, Princess Mingzhu felt extremely helpless. Her opponent's attitude made her feel extremely uncomfortable. Xiao Yang felt even more helpless in his heart. There were some things that were not easy to say out loud. Since that was the case, he could only force himself to continue fighting. Then, Xiao Yang put away the godly sword in his hand and stood there. Seeing that Xiao Yang had put away the godly sword, Princess Mingzhu's attitude changed drastically. What did this count as? Was this a provocation? Was this disdain? Aren't you going a bit overboard? Princess Mingzhu said through gritted teeth. It could be said that her opponent's actions caused Princess Mingzhu to feel extremely uncomfortable. His actions were akin to looking down on her. How could the high and mighty Princess Mingzhu endure such treatment? If that's what you think, then so be it. Since you're so eager to fight, I will naturally accompany you to the end. It's up to you whether or not we'll stop when the time comes, Xiao Yang said coldly. Princess Mingzhu had always had a high and mighty attitude, as if whatever she did was a matter of course. However, Xiao Yang's actions were against the rules. What was this? She was originally suppressed by the 3,000 small worlds, so she was angry. Looking at this otherworldly fairy-like appearance, it was inevitable that the anger and discomfort in his heart would increase. Chapter 2133. Faced with Xiao Yang's words and attitude, Princess Mingzhu was so angry that her lungs were about to explode. He was probably as arrogant as he could be. Wasn't this fellow a little too arrogant? Princess Mingzhu held her sword tightly. At the same time, the anger in her heart began to gather. It was accumulating like a mountain torrent. It was as if once it exploded, it would be uncontrollable and the world would suffer. All along, Princess Mingzhu had been high and mighty and was respected by thousands of people. However, this person looked down on her. How could she tolerate it? Moreover, his words were full of provocation, which made her feel even more uncomfortable. Instantly, Xiao Yang felt the pressure increase by a lot. It was obvious that the princess was in a state of rage. Regarding this, Xiao Yang could not do anything about it. If he could use all of his power, he would not be in such a state. However, he had to be careful when facing the suppression of the Great Path. If he forced himself to do so and really attracted the second heavenly punishment, then he would really suffer a great loss. After all, the heavenly punishment that targeted King Wu and the power that targeted a martial emperor could not be mentioned in the same breath. Even if he had to carefully control his strength, Xiao Yang was no longer afraid of stage fright. So what if he could not use it? However, his physical strength alone was enough to rival a martial emperor. Therefore, this was where Xiao Yang's confidence came from. His spiritual power was suppressed, but his physical body was not. Spiritual power was more or less an external thing, but his physical body was his. He had to refine it himself to be able to achieve this. You don't know what's good for you. Princess Mingzhu shouted angrily. She swung her sword and slashed. After the slash, countless sword qi poured out like a continuous drizzle and danced toward Xiao Yang. This rain of swords could be said to be extremely beautiful. However, the killing intent in it was not to be underestimated. Cultivators below the level of a martial emperor would suffer a great loss of vitality if they came into contact with even a little bit of sword qi. It was even normal for those who were weaker to die under this sword qi. The power of this slash was so terrifying with the support of the Great Path. Xiao Yang scoffed coldly. He immediately gathered his will and became his most terrifying defense. Instantly he moved like a rabbit. He tried his best to avoid the sword rain and charged toward Princess Mingzhu. When she saw that her opponent was about to close in on her, Princess Mingzhu understood that her opponent was preparing for a close-range battle so that she could not use her advantage at all. What a scheme! Princess Mingzhu suddenly laughed. Now, she realized that her opponent did not look down on her. She was to target, to find her weakness. If that was the case, then the nature would naturally be different. Since that was the case, such an opponent was worthy of respect. Perhaps it was because Princess Mingzhu was in the Great Path, so there were some small changes that she did not notice. It was normal for her to discover what was going on. If Xiao Yang wanted to win, he could only rely on the strength of his physical body to force her to the ground. Although the will was powerful, it was starting to become difficult to withstand the sword rain's attack. If there were more, there would be a flaw. 7 steps of the barbarian god. Xiao Yang roared and shattered the sword chi in front of him with a punch. At the same time, he disappeared on the spot. When he reappeared, he was already in front of Princess Mingzhu. A straight punch came down with a loud bang. When Princess Mingzhu saw this, she kept waving the sword in her hand. A sword flower appeared. Boom! Xiao Yang's punch landed directly on the sword flower. In the blink of an eye, the sword flower was torn into pieces. Under the attack of such a huge force, it was as if it could not withstand it at all. However, after the sword flower was torn apart, it did not dissipate. Instead, it was like a file, carving toward Xiao Yang's arm. At the same time, the sword in Princess Mingzhu's hand slashed towards his waist. It could be said that she was full of murderous intent. Princess Mingzhu knew very well that if she could not force Xiao Yang away as soon as possible, she would be in a completely passive position. Xiao Yang also understood that once the distance between them was pulled apart, the chances of him obtaining victory would be greatly reduced. Close combat was his only advantage. Pain kept coming from his arm. Xiao Yang could only grit his teeth and endure it. He allowed his skin and flesh to tear as he continued to punch. Bang! With a dull thud, the sharp sword that was slashing towards his waist was deflected by the huge force and brushed past the tip of Xiao Yang's foot. That punch had already smashed down. Princess Mingzhu's other hand immediately formed a seal. With a low roar, rays of golden light appeared in front of her chest. It was dazzling. Boom! Under the might of the punch, the golden light was directly shattered. As for Princess Mingzhu, she was unable to withstand the enormous power and was sent flying. After sending her flying, Xiao Yang originally wanted to take advantage of her to end the battle. However, he felt a pain in his lower abdomen. When he looked down, a sword flower had appeared out of nowhere and was strangling his lower abdomen. Thinking about it carefully, Princess Mingzhu had probably attacked again when the golden light was blooming. That was the terrifying part of a battle between geniuses. They could be said to be scheming. They had grasped every detail perfectly. It was unexpected and difficult to defend against. Xiao Yang did not dare to continue charging forward. With a low roar, he immediately shattered the powerful sword flower on his arm into pieces. He clasped his hands in front of his lower abdomen, grabbed the sword flower and crushed it. However, when Xiao Yang was done, Princess Mingzhu had already stabilized her body. Furthermore, when she saw how valiant Xiao Yang was and how easily he had crushed her technique, she was shocked. Just how strong was his physical body? Wasn't this a little too abnormal? Now, Princess Mingzhu truly did not understand what was going on. Xiao Yang did not care. He glanced at the sword mark that appeared on his arm and patted it casually. It would be difficult to recover from those injuries without 10 days to half a month. Especially his lower abdomen, it was even more terrifying. Although the sword mark looked clear, it was already a bloody mess. The hidden killing intent was probably nothing more than that. Chapter 2134. Xiao Yang smiled bitterly as he looked at his badly mutilated abdomen. Although it was only a superficial wound, it did not hurt his core. However, with his current physical defense, in addition to the fact that his willpower had not been broken, the fact that it could cause such a terrifying injury to him was not to be underestimated. It could be said that Princess Mingzhu's sword flower could be considered as an existence that could ignore defense to a certain extent. Therefore, how could Xiao Yang not panic at all? Xiao Yang had to be more cautious because of such an outcome. Initially, he thought that with his willpower he could go on a rampage and beat his opponent to the ground with his fists. However, it seemed like his idea was not going to work. After all, there were many things that he had to worry about, and it was difficult for him to be careless. After Princess Mingzhu coughed violently for a few times, there was a trace of blood at the corner of her mouth. Although she blocked the punch earlier with her unique technique, she was still severely injured. However, she had already suffered quite a bit of shock. His chest also suffered a great impact, and even his internal organs were slightly displaced. Princess Mingzhu's mouth twitched a few times. She did not expect this young man's physical strength to be so strong. This could be said to be inconceivable. In that case, with such a strong physical body, it was not impossible for him to block the 9 heavenly punishments, in addition to the support of various techniques. Even so, it was hard to deny how terrifying the heavenly punishments were. Then, Princess Mingzhu took a deep breath. She had a clear plan in her heart. Xiaoyang must have used the power of the heavenly punishments to refine his body, which was why his physical body was so strong. However, such a thought was enough to shock anyone. Such a method could only be described as crazy. This guy was sometimes so dauntless and reckless, just like a lunatic. It seems like you think that using your physical strength to defeat me is the best choice? Princess Mingzhu said as the corners of her mouth curled up slightly. Although she had indeed suffered a loss before, in her opinion, it was enough for her to suffer a loss once. There were some methods that he could see the flaws in just by looking at it once, and then he could solve it. That didn't seem to be a difficult task. Therefore, Princess Mingzhu could be said to be fearless. Her state of mind became even more peaceful and quiet. As long as he calmed down a little and didn't get angry because he thought that the other party had underestimated him and messed up his mental state, it would be much easier for him to guard against the other party's moves. For now, it is indeed the best choice. Xiaoyang smiled bitterly. If it weren't for the suppression of the 3,000 small worlds on him, making it difficult for him to use the spiritual power of a martial emperor expert, how could he choose the second best? Of course, if the two could be used flexibly, they would be able to display their strength to the greatest extent. Otherwise, everything would be empty talk. If you continue like this, then your decision will be wrong, and you will definitely lose. Princess Mingzhu frowned and said coldly. At this point, Princess Mingzhu felt that she could definitely see through the other party's flaws. As long as she could see it, the outcome of the battle would naturally be decided. Xiaoyang smiled and said, "You'll know once you give it a try." Princess Mingzhu frowned as soon as he said that. She couldn't be sure if Xiaoyang was telling the truth or provoking her state of mind. Also, because of Xiaoyang's previous actions, she felt that it was hard to figure out. However, no matter what the reason was, Princess Mingzhu's heart had already calmed down. There were some problems that didn't need to be too tangled up. After all, victory was in her hands. Right now, Princess Mingzhu was very satisfied with her current state. Therefore, under such a premise, she didn't think that she would lose. Then, Princess Mingzhu held the sword in her hand horizontally, and at the same time her other hand was gently wiping the blade. She looked very focused. When Xiaoyang saw this, he immediately suppressed the pain and began to calculate in his heart what kind of method he had to use to defeat his opponent. Although winning or losing didn't matter to Xiaoyang. However, if he wanted to use his opponent as a good whetstone, then he had to plan everything to obtain victory. Otherwise, if he held back everything, he might never be able to see his limits in such a battle. At this moment, the atmosphere became tit for tat again. Their auras were like that of a ferocious tiger and lion. They fought endlessly, and it was hard to tell who would win. In the blink of an eye, Princess Mingzhu waved the sword in her hand, and instantly countless sword auras appeared around her. The sword auras were densely packed, and as they intersected, there was no chance of survival. Even a fly would be sliced into countless pieces if it were to fly through the rain of swords. The sword auras seemed to have become one with Princess Mingzhu. With every breath she took, The sword rain surged endlessly like a rising tide. After every surge, the power of the sword auras seemed to increase by a lot. Xiao Yang also felt the terror of the rain of swords. Immediately, his expression changed drastically. Perhaps Princess Mingzhu was already prepared to use her trump card because she was at a disadvantage previously, and she was ready to fight to the end. At the very least, Xiao Yang wouldn't be able to fight his opponent so easily anymore. Although they didn't spend much time on this battle, Princess Mingzhu knew that she had to end it quickly. Otherwise, if he were to wait for a long time, he might not be able to withstand Xiao Yang's fist if he were to reveal any flaws. By then, she would definitely lose. That kind of situation was not what Princess Mingzhu wanted to see. Although they had verbally said that they would stop when the time was right, they all had their own goals. They all wanted to win this battle. However, no matter who wanted to win, they would have to give it their all. Otherwise, it would only be empty talk, and there wouldn't be much meaning. In the next moment, following a low roar, the countless sword cheese underwent a great change in an instant. Golden light shone brightly and dazzlingly. Green sky, sword rain. Princess Mingzhu held the sword in her hand horizontally, and the sword rain emitted golden lights as it slashed toward the young man. Chapter 2135. Looking at the rain of swords rushing towards him, Xiao Yang let out a low roar. At the same time, he gathered all of his mental energy. Xiao Yang did not retreat when he saw the rain of golden arrows. Instead, he charged towards the rain of arrows. Since he could use the heavenly punishment lightning calamity to temper his body, he could use his martial skills as well. Of course, Xiao Yang had the confidence to do so. The strength of his body had long exceeded the range that ordinary people could accept. His body was so strong that it was comparable to a ferocious beast. He charged into the rain of swords. Immediately, countless sword auras clashed against his will. They broke, and the sound of shattering could be heard. However, in the next moment, Xiao Yang's expression changed. Unknowingly, wounds had appeared on his body. He did not feel any pain. It could even be said that everything happened without any warning, catching him off guard. At the same time, it was hard to understand why. Sometimes, the truth made people feel helpless. The speed of development was so fast. Princess Mingzhu looked at Xiao Yang's valiant appearance, and a faint smile appeared on her face. If the other party did not respect him, then he would definitely suffer a lot. Move like thunder. Xiao Yang let out a low roar. Immediately, lightning started to flow out from his body, protecting him within it. His entire body was like a ball of lightning as he charged straight towards the outside. Xiao Yang already had an answer in his heart. It must be because the Trichiliacosm had given Princess Mingzhu a special ability. That was why she could break his defense so easily. If this stalemate were to continue, he would probably suffer greatly as well. In the blink of an eye, Xiao Yang had already charged out of the sword aura. He appeared in front of Princess Mingzhu and threw a punch without any hesitation. Princess Mingzhu immediately waved her sword. Instantly, several sword flowers appeared at the same time, as if she wanted to force Xiao Yang to retreat. However, the punch still blasted out and sent Princess Mingzhu flying backward. Those sword flowers landed solidly on Xiao Yang's body. Due to the pain, he could only move forward and crush those sword flowers with his hands. By the time he had completely crushed all the sword flowers, his hands were already covered in wounds. It could be said that they were badly mutilated. The price he had paid for these attacks was not small either. Princess Mingzhu, on the other hand, suffered internal injuries after taking 2 punches in succession. However, his unwillingness to submit made it so that he would not lower his head. Although he was injured, wasn't the other party the same? Furthermore, in Princess Mingzhu's opinion, the other party's injuries might even be more serious than hers. Princess Mingzhu was caught off guard by such a method of fighting in the mountains where one's life was exchanged for another's. In the face of such a crazy and reckless attack, he was really helpless. It seemed that as long as they were willing to fight, it would be very easy for them to kill their way out. Sometimes there was no need to pay attention to the method at all. It was as if it was tidying up, which could catch the opponent off guard and make it difficult to figure out. In this way, the opponent would naturally reveal his flaws. You really are a lunatic. Princess Mingzhu could not help but subconsciously suck in a breath of cold air as she spoke with lingering fear in her heart. Thinking about everything that happened previously, she really found it hard to accept. Wasn't this kind of fighting style a little too much? Xiao Yang smiled bitterly and said, "There's no other way. This is the only way to defeat you." Xiao Yang was not having a good time at the moment. His body was already covered with sword wounds of various sizes. Especially when he was in the Rain of Swords, his entire body was injured. If that's the case, it seems like you're determined to determine the winner. Princess Mingzhu snorted coldly and said. Xiao Yang smiled and said, "Didn't you have such thoughts from the beginning? Perhaps you wanted to restrain yourself at the beginning. However, when you attacked, you couldn't control yourself anymore." As soon as he said that, Princess Mingzhu's expression changed drastically. Such a statement was definitely not something that was shocking to hear. Princess Mingzhu was indeed unable to control her state of mind at the moment. But what she did not understand was how did Xiao Yang know? That was the unbelievable part. However, Princess Mingzhu was in a very bad mood and did not want to continue talking. She waved the sword in her hand, and her aura began to surge. Since her opponent wanted to end the battle quickly, she would go along with him. As she waved the sword aura was already unstoppable like a great wall. "Fierce winter sun!" As she shouted, Princess Mingzhu slashed with her sword. Instantly, countless scorching sword auras fell from the sky and landed on the world. When he felt the scorching sword auras, Xiao Yang also felt the pain on his skin. Countless sword qi looked incomparably hot, and at the same time, it was also very beautiful. Fist breaking 1,000 refinements. Xiao Yang roared. Instantly, the will qi began to expand rapidly and began to devour the scorching sword auras. When this breath of will expanded, its power was even more extraordinary. So what if the sword qi had the support of the trichiliocosm? In the face of absolute power, they began to shatter. Of course, that was only the majority. There were still countless sword auras that pierced through the will qi and the fist will, piercing towards Xiao Yang's body. Going against the great Tao was so tragic. You were restrained everywhere. When Xiao Yang stepped over the scorching sword auras and was within 100 feet of Princess Mingzhu, he suddenly felt a chill. The huge perception between the two of them caused Xiao Yang's movements to become much slower. However, this punch was Xiao Yang's only chance to turn the tables. This punch was an extension of the 10,000 elephant true intent. Xiao Yang only comprehended it after he broke through to the martial emperor realm. As for the power of this punch, it relied more on the strength of the body itself. In the blink of an eye, Xiao Yang's punch was already above Princess Mingzhu. As long as the punch landed, her head would be blown open. Qi. The sword took the lead and pierced Xiao Yang's chest. For a moment, it could be said that everything was silent. Princess Mingzhu raised her head and looked at the fist that was filled with will qi. Her gaze was completely dazed. It was as if she was only a breath away from death.